Her cloak had not looked especially waterproof, and that friendly traveler, who was supposed to come along within 1.6 hours, would have hove up in a hostelry or haymow till the roads dried enough to be passable. Danworthy had taught Kivrin how to make a fire, but she could hardly do so with wet kindling and numb hands. Winters in the 1300s had been cold. It might even be snowing. The Little Ice Age had just begun in 1320, the weather eventually getting so cold that the Thames froze over. The low temps and erratic weather had played such havoc with the crops that some historians blamed the Black Death's horrors on the malnourished state of the peasants. The weather had certainly been bad. In the autumn of 1348, it had rained in one part of Oxfordshire every day. From Michaelmas to Christmas, Kevin was probably lying there on the wet road, half dead from hypothermia and broken out in a rash, he thought. From her overdoting tutor worrying too much about her. Mary was right, he did sound like Mrs. Gadsden. The next thing he knew, he'd be plunging off into 1320, forcing the doors of the net open, like Mrs. Gadsden on the tube, and Kivrin would be as glad to see him as William was going to be to see his mother. And as in need of help, Kivrin was the brightest and most resourceful student he had ever had. She surely knew enough to get in, out of the rain, for all he knew. She had spent her last vacca with the Eskimos, learning to build an igloo. She had certainly thought of everything else, even down to her fingernails, when she had come in to show him her costume. She had held up her hands, her nails had been broken off, and there were traces of dirt in the cuticles. I know I'm supposed to be nobility, but rural nobility, and they did a lot of farm chores in between, bayou tapestries and east riding. Ladies didn't have scissors till the 1600s, so I spent Sunday afternoon in Montoya's dig, grubbing among the dead bodies to get this effect. Her nails had looked dreadful and utterly authentic. There was obviously no reason to worry about a minor detail, like snow, but he couldn't help it if he could speak to Bree. Ask him what he'd meant when he said something wrong. Make certain the drop had gone properly and that there hadn't been too much slippage. He might be able to stop worrying, but Mary had not been able even to get Bettery's NHS number till Finch phoned with it. He wondered if Bettery was still unconscious or worse. He got up and went over to the tea trolley and made himself a cup of tea. Gilchrist was on the phone again, apparently speaking to the porter. The porter didn't know where Bersingham was either. When Dunworthy had talked to him, he had told him he thought Bersingham had mentioned Loch Balchulan, a lake that turned out not to exist. Danworthy drank his tea. Gilchrist rang up the bursar and the deputy warden, neither of whom knew where Bersingham had gone. The nurse who had guarded the door earlier came in and finished the blood test. The male medic picked up one of the inspirational brochures and began to read it. Montoya filled out her admissions form and her lists of contacts. "What am I supposed to do?" she asked, unworthy. "Write down the people I've been in contact with today." The past 3 days, he said. They continued to wait. Dunworthy drank another cup of tea. Montoya rang up the NHS and tried to persuade them to give her a quarantine exemption so she could go back to the dig. The female medic went back to sleep. The nurse wheeled in a trolley with supper on it. Great chair mad or hostess, the sopa cetus unknown. Latimer said the only remark he had made all afternoon. While they eat, Gilchrist regaled Latimer with his plans for sending Kivrin to the aftermath of the Black Death. The accepted historical view is that it completely destroyed medieval society, he told Latimer as he cut his roast beef. But my research indicates it was purgative rather than catastrophic. From whose point of view? Dunworthy thought. Wondering what was taking so long, he wondered if they were truly processing the blood tests, or if they were simply waiting for one or all of them to collapse across the tea trolley so they could get a fix on the incubation period. Gilchrist rang up New College again and asked for Basingham's secretary. "She's not there," Dunworthy said. "She's in Devonshire with her daughter for Christmas." Gilchrist ignored him. "Yes, I need to get a message through to her. I'm trying to reach Mr. Basingham. It's an emergency. We've just sent an historian to the 1300s. And Beryl failed to properly screen the tech. Who ran the net as a result? He's contracted a contagious virus." He put the phone down. "If Mr. Chowdhury fails to have any of the necessary antivirals, I'm holding you personally responsible, Mr. Dunworthy." He had the full course in September. Dunworthy said, "Have you proof of that?" Gilchrist said, "Did it come through?" The medic asked. They all. Even Latimer turned to look at her in surprise. Until she'd spoken, she'd seemed fast asleep, her head far forward on her chest and her arms folded, holding the contacts list. "You said you sent somebody back to the Middle Ages," she said belligerently. "Did it?" "I'm afraid I don't," Gilchrist said. "This virus," she said. "Could it have come through the time machine?" Gilchrist looked nervously at Dunworthy. "That is impossible, is it?" "No," Dunworthy said. "It was obvious." Gilchrist knew nothing about the continuum, paradoxes, or string theory. The man had no business being acting head. He didn't even know how the net he had so blithely sent Kevin through worked. The virus couldn't have come through the net. Dr. Aaron said the Indian was the only case. The medic said, "And you said?" She pointed at Dunworthy that he'd had the full course. If he's had his antivirals, he couldn't catch a virus, unless it was a disease from somewhere else, and the Middle Ages was full of diseases. "Wasn't it smallpox and the plague?" Gilchrist said. "I'm certain that medieval has taken steps to protect against that possibility. There's no possibility of a virus coming through the net," Dunworthy said angrily. "The space-time continuum does not allow it to happen. You send people through," she persisted, "and a virus is smaller than a person." Dunworthy hadn't heard that argument since the early years of the nets, when the theory was only partially understood. "I assure you we've taken every precaution," Gilchrist said. "Nothing that would affect the course of history can go through a net," Dunworthy explained, glaring at Gilchrist. The man was simply encouraging her with his talk of precautions and probabilities. "Radiation toxins, microbes, none of them has ever passed through a net. If they're present, the net simply won't open." The medic looked unconvinced. "I assure you," Gilchrist said, and Mary came in. She was carrying a sheaf of variously colored papers. Gilchrist stood up immediately. "Dr. Orens, is there a possibility that this viral infection Mr. Chowdhury has contracted might have come through the net?" "Of course not," she said, frowning as if the whole idea were ridiculous. "In the first place, diseases can't come through the net. It would violate the paradoxes. In the second place, if it had, which it can't, Badri would have caught it less than an hour after it came through, which would mean the virus had an incubation period of an hour. And after impossibility, but if it did, which it can't, you all would be down already." She looked at her digital. "Since it's been over 3 hours since you were exposed to it." She began collecting the contacts list. Gilchrist looked irritated. As acting head of the history faculty, "I have responsibilities I must attend to," he said. "How long do you intend to keep us here?" "Only long enough to collect your contacts list," she said, "and to give you your instructions. Perhaps 5 minutes." She took Latimer's list from him. Montoya grabbed hers up from the end table and began writing hastily. 5 minutes, the medic, who had asked about the virus coming through the net, said. "Do you mean we're free to go on medical probation?" She said. She put the lists at the bottom of her sheaf of papers and began passing the top sheets, which were a virulent pink, around to everyone. They appeared to be a release form of some sort, absolving the infirmary of any and all responsibility. "We've completed your blood tests," she went on, "and none of them show an increased level of antibodies." She handed Dunworthy a blue sheet, which absolved the NHS of any and all responsibility and confirmed willingness to pay any and all charges not covered by the NHS in full and within 30 days. "I've been in touch with the WIC, and their recommendation is controlled observation, with continuous fetal monitoring and blood samples at 12-hour intervals." The sheet she was distributing now was green and headed, "Instructions for primary contacts. No." One was avoid contact with others. Downworthy thought of Finch and the bell ringers, waiting no doubt at the gate of Balliol with summons and scriptures, and of all those Christmas shoppers and detainees. "Between here and there, record your temp at half-hour intervals," she said, passing around a yellow form. "Come in immediately if your monitor." She tapped at her own shows a marked increase in temp. Some fluctuation is normal. Tongue tend to rise in the late afternoon and evening. Any temp between 36 and 37.4 is normal. Come in immediately if your temp exceeds 37.4 or rises suddenly, or if you begin to feel any symptoms: headache, tightness in the chest, mental confusion, or dizziness. Everyone looked at his or her monitor and no doubt began to feel a headache coming on. Dunworthy had had a headache all afternoon. "Avoid contact with others as much as possible," Mary said. "Keep careful track of any contacts you do have. We're still uncertain of the mode of transmission, but most mix of viruses spread by droplet and direct contact. Wash your hands with soap and water frequently." She handed Dunworthy another pink sheet. She was running out of colors. This one was a log-headed contacts and under it name, address, type of contact, time. It was unfortunate that Badri's virus had not had to deal with the CDC, the NHS, and the WIC. It would never have gotten the door. "You must report back here at 7 tomorrow morning. In the meantime, I'd recommend a good supper and then to bed. Rest is the best defense against any virus. You are off duty," she said, looking at the medics, "for the duration of the temp quarantine." She passed out several more rainbow-hued papers and then asked brightly any questions. Downworthy looked at the medic, waiting for her to ask Mary if smallpox had come through the net, but she was looking uninterestedly at her clutch of papers. "Can I go back to my dig?" Montero asked. "Not unless it's inside the quarantine perimeter." Mary said, "Well, great," she said, jamming her papers angrily into the pockets of her terrorist jacket. "The whole village will have washed away while I'm stuck here," she stomped out. "Are there any other questions?" Mary said imperturbably. "Very well. Then I'll see you all at 7 o'clock. The medics ambled out, the one who had asked about the virus yawning and stretching, as if she were preparing for another nap. Latimer was still sitting down, watching his temp monitor. Gilchrist said something snappish to him, and he got up and put his coat on and collected his umbrella and his stack of papers. "I expect to be kept informed of every development." Gilchrist said, "I am contacting Basingham and telling him it's essential that he return and take charge of this matter." He swept out and then had to wait, holding the door open, for Latimer to pick up the papers he had dropped. "Go round in the morning and collect Latimer, won't you?" Mary said, looking through the contacts list. "You'll never remember he's to be here at 7. "I want to see Badri," Dunworthy said. "Laboratory Brasenose," she said, reading from the sheets. "Dean's office, Brasenose Laboratory, Brasenose." Didn't anyone see Bardry except in the net? In the ambulance on the way here. He said something wrong. Dunworthy said there could have been slippage. If she's more than a week off, she have no idea when to rendezvous. She didn't answer. She sorted through the sheets again, frowning. I need to make certain there weren't any problems with the fix, he said insistently. She looked up. Very well, she said. These contact sheets are hopeless. There are great gaps in Bardry's whereabouts for the past 3 days. He's the only person who can tell us where he was and with whom he came in contact. She led the way back down the corridor. I've had a nurse with him asking him questions, but he's so very disoriented and fearful of her. Perhaps he won't be as frightened of you. She led the way down the corridor to the lift and said, "Ground floor, please," into its ear. "Padre is only conscious for a few moments at a time." She said to Dunworthy, "It may be most of the night." "That's all right," Dunworthy said. "I won't be able to rest till I'm sure Kevin is safely through." They went up to flights in the lift, down another corridor, and through a door marked "No Entrance, Isolation Ward." Inside the door, a grim-looking ward sister was sitting at a desk, watching a monitor. "I'm taking Mr. Dunworthy in to see Mr. Chad Hooley," Mary said. "We'll need SPGs. How is he?" "His fever's up again, 39.8, the sister said, handing them the SPGs, which were plastic-sealed bundles of paper. Clothing gowns that stripped up the back caps. Impermeable masks that were impossible to get on. Over the caps, booty-like snugs that went on over their shoes. And impermeable gloves." Dunworthy made the mistake of putting his gloves on first and took what seemed like hours, attempting to unfold the gown and affix the mask. "You'll need to ask very specific questions," Mary said. "Ask him what he did when he got up this morning, if he'd stayed the night with anyone, where he ate breakfast, who was there, that sort of thing. His high fever means that he's very disoriented. You may have to ask your questions several times." She opened the door to the room. It wasn't really a room. There was only space for the bed and a narrow camp stool, not even a chair. The wall behind the bed was covered with displays and equipment. The far wall had a curtained window and more equipment. Mary glanced briefly at Padre and then began scanning the displays. Dunworthy looked at the screens. The one nearest him was full of numbers and letters. The bottom line read, "I see you 143 to 0691, 20 to -12-54, 1803, 200/RPT, 18 CRS, IMJ PCLN, 200 meters G/Q6H NHS, 40-11-7 meters errands." Apparently the doctor's orders. The other screens showed spiking lines and columns of figures. None of them made any sense, except for a number in the middle of the small display. Second from the right it read, "Temp 39.9. Dear God." He looked at Dree. He was lying with his arms outside the bedclothes. His arms, both connected to drips that hung from stanchions. One of the drips had at least 5 bags feeding into the main tube. His eyes were closed and his face looked thin and drawn, as if he had lost weight since this morning. His dark skin had a strange purplish cast to it. "Boudreaux," Mary said, leaning over him. "Can you hear us?" He opened his eyes and looked at them, without recognition, which was probably due less to the virus than to the fact that they were covered from head to foot in paper. "It's Mr. Dunworthy," Mary said helpfully. "He's come to see you." Her bleeper started up. "Mr. Dunworthy," he said hoarsely and tried to sit up. Mary pushed him gently down into the pillow. "Mr. Dunworthy has some questions for you," she said, patting his chest gently. The way she had in the laboratory at Bray's nose, she straightened up, watching the displays on the wall behind him lie still. "I need to leave now, but Mr. Dunworthy will stay with you. Rest and try to answer Mr. Dunworthy's questions." She left. "Mr. Dunworthy," Bardry said again. as if you were trying to make sense of the words. Yes, Dunworthy said. He sat down on the camp stool. How are you feeling? When do you expect him back? Better, he said, and his voice sounded weak and strained. He tried to sit up again. Dunworthy put out his hand to stop him. Have to find him, he said. There's something wrong. Chapter 8. They were burning her at the stake. She could feel the flames. They must already have tied her to the stake, though she could not remember that, as she remembered them lighting the fire. She had fallen off the white horse, and the cutthroat had picked her up and carried her over to it. We must go back to the drop, she had told him. He had leaned over her, and she could see his cruel face in the flickering firelight. Mr. Dunworthy will open the net as soon as he realizes something's wrong. She had told him she shouldn't have told him that. He had thought she was a witch and had brought her here to be burned. I'm not a witch, she said. And immediately a hand came out of nowhere and rested coolly on her forehead. Her voice said, I am not a witch, she said. Trying to speak slowly so they would understand her, the cutthroat hadn't understood her. She had tried to tell him they shouldn't leave the drop, but he had paid no attention to her. He had put her on his white horse and led it out of the clearing and through the stand of white-trunked birches into the thickest part of the forest. She had tried to pay attention to which way they were going so she could find her way back. But the man's swinging lantern had lit only a few inches of ground at their feet, and the light had hurt her eyes. She had closed them, and that was a mistake, because the horse's awkward gait made her dizzy. And she had fallen off the horse onto the ground. I am not a witch, she said. I'm an historian. How fine den yoth is latte, the woman's voice said far away. She must have come forward to put a faggot on the fire, and then stepped back again away from the heat. Men were us for an unglad dunce, so duster, a man's voice said. And the voice sounded like Mr. Dunworth's. I and Menormas were a lau behader curba. Swelta shat a motor blowin', the woman said. Mr. Dunworthy, Kivrin said, holding out her arms to him. I've fallen among cutthroats, but she couldn't see him through the smothering smoke. The woman said, and Kivrin knew that. It was later that she had impossibly slept. How long does it take to burn? She wondered. The fire was so hot she should be ashes by now. But when she held her hand up, it looked untouched, though little. Red flames flickered along the edges of the fingers. The light from the flames hurt her eyes. She closed them again. I hope I don't fall off the horse again, she thought. She had been clinging to the horse, both arms around its neck, though its uneven walk made her head ache even worse. And she had not let go, but she had fallen off even though Mr. Dunworthy had insisted she learn how to ride, had arranged for her to have lessons at a riding stable near Woodstock. Mr. Dunworthy had told her this would happen. He had told her they would burn her at the stake. The woman put a cup to her lips. It must be vinegar in a sponge. Kivrin thought they gave that to Martis, but it wasn't. It was a warm, bitter liquid. The woman had to tilt Kivrin's head forward to drink it, and it came to Kivrin for the first time that she was lying down. I'll have to tell Mr. Dunworthy. She thought they burned people at the stake lying down. She tried to bring her hands up to her lips in the position of prayer to activate the quarter, but the weight of the flames dragged them down again. I'm ill, Kevin thought, and knew that the warm liquid had been a medicinal potion of some kind, and that it had brought her fever down a little. She was not lying on the ground after all, but in a bed in a dark room, and the woman who had hushed her and given her the liquid was there beside her. She could hear her breathing. Kevin tried to move her head to see her. But the effort made it hurt again. The woman must be asleep. Her breathing was even and loud, almost like snoring. It hurt Kevin's head to listen to it. I must be in the village, she thought. The red-headed man must have brought me here. She had fallen off the horse, and the cutthroat had helped her back on. But when she looked into his face, he hadn't looked like a cutthroat at all. He was young with red hair and a kind expression, and he had leaned over her. Where she was sitting against the wagon wheel, kneeling on one knee beside her, and said, "Who are you?" She had understood him perfectly. Khan stood around Kotoan, the woman said, and tilted Kivrin's head forward. For more of the bitter liquid, Kevin could barely swallow. The fire was inside her throat. Now she could feel the little orange flames. Though the liquid should have put them out, she wondered if he had taken her to some foreign land. Spain or Greece, where the people spoke a language they hadn't put into the interpreter. She had understood the red-headed man perfectly. "Who are you?" he had asked. And she had thought that the other man must be a slave. He'd brought back from the Crusades, a slave who spoke Turkish or Arabic. And that was why she couldn't understand him. "I'm an historian," she had said, but when she looked up into his kind face, it wasn't him, it was the cutthroat. She looked wildly around for the red-headed man, but he wasn't there. The cutthroat picked up sticks and laid them on some stones for a fire. "Mr. Dunworthy," Kivrin called out desperately, and the cutthroat came and knelt in front of her, the light from his lantern flickering on his face. "Fear not," he said. "He will return soon." "Mr. Dunworthy," she screamed. And the red-headed man came and knelt beside her again. "I shouldn't have left the drop." She told him, watching his face, so he wouldn't turn into the cutthroat. Something must have gone wrong with the fix. "You must take me back there." He unfastened a cloak he was wearing, swinging it easily off his shoulders, and laid it over her, and she knew he understood. "I need to go home," she said to him as he bent over her. He had a lantern with him, and it lit his kind face, and flickered on his red hair like flames. "Gordefato," he called out. And she thought, that's the slave's name, Gordefato. He will ask the slave to tell him where he found me, and then he'll take me back to the drop, and Mr. Dunworthy would be frantic that she wasn't there. When he opened the net, "It's all right, Mr. Dunworthy," she had said silently, "I'm coming." "Dried the mother," the red-headed man had said, and lifted her up in his arms. "Fordle Gwyneth, come, I'm ill." Kevin said to the woman, "So I can't understand you." But this time, no one leaned forward out of the darkness to quiet her. Maybe they had tired of watching her burn and had gone away. It was certainly taking a long time, though the fire seemed to be growing hotter now. The red-headed man had set her on the white horse before him and ridden into the woods, and she had thought he must be taking her back to the drop. The horse had a saddle now and bells, and the bells jangled as they rode. Playing a tune, it was "O Come All the Faithful," and the bells grew louder and louder with each verse, till they sounded like the bells of St. Mary, the Virgins. They rode a long way, and she thought, they must surely be near the drop by now. "How far is the drop?" she asked the red-headed man. "Mr. Dunworthy will be so worried," but he didn't answer her. He rode out of the woods and down a hill. The moon was up, shining palely in the branches of a stand of narrow, leafless trees, and on the church at the bottom of the hill. "This isn't the drop," she said, and tried to pull on the horse's reins to turn it back the way they had come, but she did not dare take her arms from around the red-headed man's neck for fear she might fall. And then they were at a door, and it opened and opened again, and there was a fire and light and the sound of bells, and she knew they had brought her back to the drop, after all. She buyan psyche not ejan adith, the woman said. Her hands were wrinkled and rough on Kivrin's skin. She pulled the bed coverings up around Kivrin fur. Kivrin could feel soft fur against her face, or maybe it was her hair. Where have you brought me to? Kivrin asked. The woman leaned forward a little, as if she couldn't hear her. And Kivrin realized she must have spoken in English. Her interpreter wasn't working. She was supposed to be able to think her words in English and speak them in Middle English. Perhaps that was why she couldn't understand them. Because her interpreter wasn't working. She tried to think how to say it in Middle English. Woas du brangen metau, the construction was wrong. She must ask, what is this place? But she could not remember the Middle English for place. She could not think the woman kept piling on blankets. And the more furs she laid over her, the colder Kevin got. As if the woman was somehow putting out the fire. They would not understand what she meant if she asked, what is this place? She was in a village. The red-headed man had brought her to a village. They had ridden past a church and up to a large house. She must ask what is the name of this village. The word for place was domain, but the construction was still wrong. They would use the French construction, wouldn't they? Cal la mora vevuma protet. She said aloud, but the woman had gone away, and that was not right. They had not been French for 200 years. She must ask the question in English. Where is the village you have brought me to? But what was the word for village? Mr. Dunworthy had told her. She might not be able to depend on the interpreter. That she had to take lessons in Middle English and Norman French and German to counterbalance discrepancies in pronunciation. He had made her memorize pages and pages of Chaucer, Soon ye nuke, Baudry Brooken, and every speecher that ye spoken. No, no, where is this village you have brought me to? What was the word for village? He had brought her to a village and knocked on a door. A big man had come to the door, carrying an axe to cut the wood for the fire. Of course, a big man and then a woman, and they had both spoken words. Kevin couldn't understand, and the door had shut. And they had been outside in the darkness, Mr. Dunworthy, Dr. Aarons. She had cried, and her chest hurt too much to get the words out. You mustn't let them close the drop, she had said to the red-headed man. But he had changed again into a cutthroat. A thief, nay, he had said, she is but injured, and then the door had opened again. And he had carried her in to be burnt, she was so hot. The woman said, and Kevin tried to raise her head to drink. But the woman wasn't holding a cup, she was holding a candle close to Kevin's face. To close her hair would catch fire. Dama demoni datus daak. The woman said the candle flickered close to her cheek. Her hair was on fire, orange and red. Flames burned along the edges of her hair, catching stray wisps and twisting them into ash. The woman said, and tried to capture Kevin's hands. But Kevin struggled against her until her hands were free. She struck at her hair, trying to put the flames out. Her hands caught fire. The woman said, and held her hands still. It was not the woman, the hands were too strong. Kevin tossed her head from side to side, trying to escape the flames. But they were holding her head still too. Her hair blazed up in a cloud of fire. It was smoky in the room when she woke up. The fire must have gone out while she slept. That had happened to one of the martyrs. When they had burned him at the stake, his friends had piled green faggots on the fire, so he would die of the smoke before the fire reached him. But it had put the fire nearly out instead, and he had smoldered for hours. The woman leaned over her. It was so smoky. Kivrin couldn't see whether she was young or old. The red-headed man must have put out the fire. He had spread his cloak over her, and then gone over to the fire and put it out. Kicking it apart with his boots, and the smoke had come up and blinded her. The woman dripped water on her, and the drops sizzled on her skin. "Oh, come on," she cried and smiled. The woman said, "I am Isabelle de Beauvoir, Chevalier," said, "My brother lies ill at Evesham." She could not think of any of the words. Caldemore Parr said, "To the road." "Where am I?" she said in English. A face leaned close to hers. "How height is tower?" it said. It was the cut-throat face of the enchanted wood. She pulled back from it, frightened. "Go away," she said. "What do you want?" "In nomen patris et filius spiritus sancti." He said Latin, she thought. Thankfully, there must be a priest here. She tried to raise her head to see past the cutthroat to the priest, but she couldn't. It was too smoky in the room. "I can speak Latin," she thought. "Mr. Dunworthy made me learn it. You shouldn't have let him in here." She said in Latin, "He's a cutthroat." Her throat hurt and she seemed to have no breath to put behind the words. But from the way the cutthroat drew back in surprise, she knew they had heard her. "You must not be afraid," the priest said. And she understood him perfectly. "You do, but go home again to the drop." Givrin said, "Are you taking me to the drop?" "As per your majesty." "Domini is so p with mun dabo the present. Thou shalt sprinkle me with hyssop." "O Lord, and I shall be cleansed." She could understand him perfectly. "Help me," she said in Latin. "I must return to the place from where I came nameless." The priest said so softly, she couldn't hear him name something about her name. She raised her head. It felt curiously light, as though all her hair had burned away. "My name," she said. "Can you tell me your name?" He said in Latin. She was supposed to tell them she was Isabelle de Beauvoir. Daughter of Gilbert de Bouvier from the East Riding. But her throat hurt, so she didn't think she could get it out. "I have to go back," she said. "They won't know where I've gone." "Confido de ami patenus," the priest said. From very far away she couldn't see him. When she tried to look past the cutthroat, all she could see were flames. They must have lit the fire again. "Beat Marie Semper Virgin." He's saying the Confido Dio. She thought the prayer of confession. The cutthroat shouldn't be here. There shouldn't be anyone else in the room. During a confession, it was her turn. She tried to hold her hands in prayer and couldn't. But the priest helped her, and when she couldn't remember the words, he recited them with her. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I confess to Almighty God and to you, Father, that I have sinned exceedingly in thought, word, deed, and omission through my fault. Me culpa," she whispered. "Me culpa, me maxima culpa, through my fault, through my most grievous fault." But that wasn't right. That wasn't what she was supposed to say. "How have you sinned?" the priest said. "Sin," she said blankly. "Yes," he said gently, leaning so close. He was practically whispering in her ear. "That you may confess your sins and have God's forgiveness and enter into the kingdom eternal. All I wanted to do was to go to the Middle Ages." She thought, "I worked so hard, learning the languages and the customs and doing everything Mr. Dunworthy told me. All I wanted to do was to be an historian." She swallowed a feeling like flame. "I have not sinned." The priest drew back then, and she thought he had gone away angry because she wouldn't confess her sins. "I should have listened to Mr. Dunworthy," she said. "I shouldn't have left the drop." "In nomen patris et filii et spiritus sancti, amen," the priest said. His voice was gentle, comforting. She felt his cool touch on her forehead. "Quid deliquisti," the priest murmured. Through this holy unction and his own most tender mercy, he touched her eyes, her ears, her nostrils so lightly. She couldn't feel his hand at all, but only the cool touch of the oil. That isn't part of the sacrament of penance. Kivrin thought, that's the ritual for extreme unction. He's saying the last rites don't. Kivrin said, be not afraid, he said. May the Lord pardon thee, whatever offenses thou hast committed by walking. He said, and put out the fire that was burning the soles of her feet. Why are you giving me the last rites? Kivrin said, and then remembered they were burning her at the stake. I'm going to die here, she thought, and Mr. Dunworthy will never know what happened to me. My name is Kivrin, she said. Tell Mr. Dunworthy. May you behold your Redeemer face to face. The priest said only was the cutthroat speaking. And standing before him may you gaze, with blessed eyes on the truth made manifest. I'm dying, aren't I? She asked the priest. There is naught to fear, he said, and took her hand. Don't leave me, she said, and clutched his hand. I will not, he said. But she couldn't see him for all the smoke. May Almighty God have mercy upon thee and forgive thee thy sins and bring thee into life everlasting, he said. Please come and get me Mr. Dunworthy, she said, and the flames roared up between them. Transcript from the Doomsday Book. Dominus Matere Dignareus Sanctum Angelum, tum de Chiles, cu custodiat foviat. Protegat vi citat art, quae defendet armes arbititis and hoc arbitarculo. Break, ex audio rationem meme at clamor muse ad te veniat. O Lord, vouchsafe to send thy holy angel from heaven to guard, cherish, protect, visit, and defend all those that are assembled together in this house. Break, hear my prayer, and let my cry come unto thee. Chapter 9. What is it, Badri? What's wrong? Dunworthy asked. Cold, Badri said. Dunworthy leaned across him and pulled the sheet and blanket up over his shoulders. The blanket seemed pitifully inadequate, as thin as the paper gown Badri was wearing. No wonder he was cold. Thank you, Pedri murmured. He pulled his hand out from under the bedclothes and took hold of Dunworth's. He closed his eyes. Dunworthy glanced anxiously at the displays, but they were as inscrutable as ever. The temp still read 39.9. Badri's hands felt very hot, even through the impermeable glove. And the fingernails looked odd, almost a dark blue. Badri's skin seemed darker too, and his face looked somehow thinner. Even then, when they had brought him in, the ward sister, whose outline under her paper robe looked uncomfortably like Mrs. Gadsden's, came in and said gruffly, "The list of primary contacts is on the chart. No wonder Dry was afraid of her." "CH1, she said, pointing to the keyboard. Under the first display on the left, a chart divided into our long blocks. Came up on the screen his own name, Mary's, and the ward sisters were at the top of the chart, with the letters SPG after them in parentheses, presumably to indicate that they were wearing protective garments. When they came into contact with him, scrolled Dunworthy said, and the chart moved up over the screen, through the arrival at the hospital, the ambulance medics, the net the last 2 days. Badri had been in London, Monday morning, setting up an on-site for Jesus College. He had come up to Oxford on the tube at noon. He had come to see Dunworthy at 2:30 and was there until 4. Dunworthy entered the times on the chart, but we had told him he'd gone to London Sunday, though he couldn't remember what time he entered London. Phone Jesus for time of arrival. He drifts in and out a good bit, the sister said disapprovingly. It's a fever. She checked the drips, gave a yank to the bedclothes, and went out. The doors shutting seemed to wake up Pedro up. His eyes fluttered open. "I need to ask you some questions," Badri Dunworthy said. "We need to find out who you've seen and talked to. We don't want them to come down with this. And we need you to tell us who they are." "Kevin," he said. His voice was soft, almost a whisper, but his hand was holding tightly to Dunworth's. "In the laboratory, This morning, Dunworthy said. Did you see Kevin before this morning? Did you see her yesterday? No. What did you do yesterday? I checked the net, he said weakly, and his hand clung to Dunworthy's. Were you there all day? He shook his head the effort, producing a whole series of bleeps and climbs. On the displays. I went to see you. Dunworthy nodded. You left me a note. What did you do after that? Did you see Kevin? Cliverin, he said. I checked Perhowski's coordinates. Were they correct? He frowned. Yes. Are you certain? Yes, I verified them twice. He stopped to catch his breath. I ran an internal check in a comparator. Dunworthy felt a rush of relief. There hadn't been a mistake in the coordinates. What about the slippage? How much slippage was there? Headache, he murmured this morning. Must have drunk too much at the dance. What dance? Tired, he murmured. What dance did you go to? Dunworthy persisted, feeling like an Inquisition torturer. When was it? Monday? Tuesday? Driss said. Drank too much. He turned his head away on the pillow. You rest now, Dunworthy said. He gently disengaged his hand from Barry's. Try to get some sleep. Glad you came. Badri said and reached for it again, down where they held it, watching Badri in the displays by turns as he slept. It was raining. He could hear the patter of drops behind the closed curtains. He had not realized how ill Badri really was. He had been too worried about Kevin to even think about him. Perhaps he shouldn't be so angry with Montoya. And the rest of them, they had their preoccupations too. And none of them had stopped to think what Padres' illness meant except in terms of the difficulties and inconvenience it caused, even Mary. Talking about needing Buckley Johnson for an infirmary and the possibilities of an epidemic hadn't brought home the reality of Padri's illness and what it meant. He had had his antivirals, and yet he lay here with a fever of 39.9. The evening passed. Worthy listened to the rain and the chiming of the quarter hours at St. Hilda's, and more distantly Christ Church. The ward sister informed Dunworthy grimly that she was going off duty, and a much smaller and more cheerful blonde nurse, wearing the insignia of a student, came in to check the drips and look at the displays. Burris struggled in and out of consciousness with an effort Dunworthy would hardly have described as drifting. He seemed more and more exhausted each time he fought his way back to consciousness, and less able to answer Dunworthy's questions. Dunworthy kept at it mercilessly. The Christmas dance had been in Headington. Bettery had gone to a pub afterward. He couldn't remember the name of it. Monday night he had worked alone in the laboratory, checking Perlsk's coordinates. He had come up at noon from London on the tube. This was impossible to passengers and party-goers, and everyone he had had contact with in London. They would never be able to trace and test all of them, even if. How did you get to Brasenose this morning? Dunworthy asked the next time Bedrid drifted awake again. Morning, Bettery said, looking at the curtained window, as if he thought it were morning already. How long have I been asleep? Dunworthy didn't know how to answer that. He'd been asleep off and on all evening. It's 10, he said, looking at his digital. We brought you into hospital at 1:30. You ran the net this morning. You sent Kevin through. Do you remember when you began feeling ill? What's the date? Badri said suddenly. December the 22nd. You've only been here part of one day. The year, Badri said, attempting to sit up. What's the year? Dunworthy glanced anxiously at the displays. His temp was nearly 40.0. The year is 2054, he said, bending over him to calm him. It's December the 22nd. Back up, Bettery said. Dunworthy straightened and stepped back from the bed. Back up, he said again. He pushed himself up farther and looked around the room. Where's Mr. Dunworthy? I need to speak to him. "I'm right here, Boudry." Dunworthy took a step toward the bed and then stopped. "Afraid of upsetting him, what did you want to tell me? Do you know where he might be?" Then, Boudry said, "Would you give him this note?" He handed him an imaginary sheet of paper. And Dunworthy realized he must be reliving Tuesday afternoon, when he had come to Balliol. "I have to get back to the net." He looked at an imaginary digital. "Is the laboratory open?" "What did you want to talk to Mr. Dunworthy about?" Dunworthy asked. "Was it the slippage, no backup? You're going to drop at the lid." He looked straight at Dunworthy, his eyes bright with fever. "What are you waiting for? Go and fetch him." The student nurse came in. "He's delirious," Dunworthy said. She gave Boudry a cursory glance, and then looked up at the displays. They seemed ominous to Dunworthy, feeding numbers frantically across the screens, and zigzagging in 3 dimensions. But the student nurse didn't seem particularly concerned. She looked at each of the displays in turn, and calmly began adjusting the flow on the drips. "Let's lie down, all right," she said, still without looking at Pedro, and amazingly he did. "I thought you'd gone," he said to her, lying back against the pillow. "Thank goodness you're here," he said, and seemed to collapse all over again, though this time there was nowhere to fall. The student nurse hadn't noticed. She was still adjusting the drips. "He's fainted," Dunworthy said. She nodded and began calling reads onto the display. She didn't so much as glance at Boudry, who looked deathly pale under his dark skin. "Don't you think you should call a doctor?" Dunworthy said. And the door opened and a tall woman in SPGS came in. She didn't look at Madry either. She read the monitors one by one and then asked, "Indications of pleural involvement. Cyanosis and chills," the nurse said. "What's he getting?" "Mix of Braven," she said. The doctor took his stethoscope down from the wall, untangling the chest piece from the connecting cord. "Any humptitis?" She shook her head. "Cold," Dry said from the bed. Neither of them paid the slightest attention. Dry began to shiver. "Don't drop it, it was China, wasn't it?" "I want 50 cc's of aqueous penicillin and an AS. A pack," the doctor said. She sat bedridden, shivering harder than ever, up in bed, and peeled the Velcro strips of his paper. Nightgown open, she pressed the stethoscope's chest piece against Boudry's back in what seemed to Dunworthy to be a cruel and unusual punishment. "Take a deep breath," the doctor said, her eyes on the display. "But we did." His teeth chattering. "Minor pleural consolidation. Lower left," the doctor said cryptically, and moved the chest piece over a centimeter another. She moved the chest piece several more times, and then said, "Do we have an I don't yet?" "Mix of virus," the nurse said, filling a syringe type of sequencing. "Not yet." She fit the syringe into the cannula and pushed the plunger down. Somewhere outside a telephone rang. The doctor Velcroed the top of Boudry's nightgown together, lowered him back to the bed again, and flipped the sheet carelessly over his legs. "Give me a gram stain," she said, and left. The phone was still ringing. Dunworthy longed to pull the blanket up over Boudry properly, but the student nurse was hooking another drip onto the stanchion. He waited till she had finished with the drip and gone out, and then straightened the sheet and pulled the blanket carefully up over Boudry's shoulders and tucked it in at the side of the bed. "Is that better?" he said. But Boudry had already stopped shivering and gone to sleep. Dunworthy looked at the displays. His temp was already down to 39.2. And the previously frantic lines on the other screens were steady and strong. "Mr. Dunworthy," the student's nurse's voice came from somewhere on the wall. "There's a telephone call for you." "It's a Mr. Finch." Dunworthy opened the door. The student nurse, out of her SPGS, motioned to him to take off his gown. He did, dumping the garments in the large cloth hamper. She indicated, "Your spectacles, please." She said he handed them to her. And she began spritzing disinfectant on them. He picked up the phone, squinting at the screen. "Mr. Dunworthy, I've been looking for you everywhere." Finch said the most dreadful things happened. "What is it?" Dunworthy said. He glanced at his digital. It was 10 o'clock, too early for someone to have come down with the virus. If the incubation period was 12 hours, is someone ill? No, sir. It's worse than that. It's Mrs. Gadsden. She's in Oxford. She got through the quarantine perimeter somehow. I know the last train she made them hold the doors. Yes, well, she called from hospital. She insists on staying at Balliol, and she accused me of not taking proper care of William, because I was the one who typed out the tutor assignments, and apparently his tutors made him stay up over back to read Petrarch. Tell her we haven't any room. Tell her the dormitories are being sterilized. I did, sir, but she said in that case she would room with William. I don't like to do that to him, sir. No, Downworthy said. There are some things one shouldn't have to endure, even in an epidemic. Have you told William his mother's coming? No, sir. I tried, but he's not in college. Tom Gailey told me Mr. Gadsden was visiting a young lady at Shrewsbury. So I rang her up, but there was no answer. No doubt they're out reading Pet Rock somewhere. Dunworthy said, wondering what would happen if Mrs. Gadsden should come upon the unwary couple on her way to Balliol. I don't see why he should be doing that, sir, Finch said, sounding troubled. Or why his tutor should have assigned Petticoat at all. He's reading for Maud's. Yes, well, when Mrs. Gadsden arrives, put her in Warren. The nurse looked up sharply from polishing his spectacles. It's across the quad at any rate. Give her a room that doesn't look out on anything, and check our supply of rash ointment. Yes, sir, Finch said. I spoke with the bursar at New College. She said Mr. Basingham told her before he left that he wanted to be free of distractions, but she said she assumed he told someone where he was going, and that she tried to phone his wife as soon as the line settled down. Did you ask about their techs? Yes, sir. Finch said all of them have gone home for the holidays. Which of our techs live the closest to Oxford? Finch thought for a moment. That would be Andrews. In reading, would you like his number? Yes, and make me up a list of the others. Numbers and addresses. Finch recited Andrews' number. I've taken steps to remedy the lavatory paper situation. I've put up notices with the motto, waste leads to want. Wonderful, Dunworthy said. He rang off and tried Andrews' number. It was engaged. The student nurse handed him back his spectacles and a new bundle of SPGs, and he put them on. Taking care this time to put the mask on before the cap, and to leave the gloves till last. It still took an unconscionable amount of time to array himself. He hoped the nurse would be sufficiently faster if Dree rang the bell for help. He went back in bed. He was still restlessly asleep. He glanced at the display. His temp read 39.4. His head ached. He took off his spectacles and rubbed at the space between his eyes. Then he sat down on the camp stool and looked at the chart of contacts he had pieced together thus far. It could scarcely be called a chart. There were so many gaps in it. The name of the pub Bardray had gone to after the dance, where Bardray had been Monday evening and Monday afternoon. He had come up from London on the tube at noon, and Danworthy had phoned him to ask him to run the net. At 2:30, where had he been those 2.5 hours, and where had he gone Tuesday afternoon? After he came to Balliol and left the note, saying he'd run a systems check on the net, back to the laboratory or to another pub, he wondered if perhaps someone at Balliol had spoken to Bardray while he was there when Finch called back to inform him of the latest developments in American bell ringers and lavatory paper. He would tell him to ask everyone who had been in college if they'd seen Berdry. The door opened and the student nurse, swathed in SPGs, came in. Dunworthy looked automatically at the displays, but he couldn't see any dramatic changes. But Dre was still asleep. The nurse entered some figures on the display, checked the drip, and tugged at a corner of the bedclothes. She opened the curtain and then stood there, twisting the cord in her hands. "I couldn't help overhearing you on the telephone," she said. "You mentioned a Mrs. Gadsden. I know it's terribly rude of me to ask. But might that have been William Gadsden's mother you were speaking of?" "Yes," he said, surprised. "William's an undergraduate at Berkeley." "Do you know him?" "He's a friend of mine," she said, flushing such a bright pink. He could see it through her imperma mask. "Ah," he said, wondering when William had time to read Petrock. "William's mother is here in hospital," he said, feeling he should warn her, but unclear as to whom to warn her about. "It seems she's come to visit him for Christmas. She's here," the nurse said, flushing an even brighter pink. "I thought we were under quarantine. Hers was the last train up from London." Dunworthy said wistfully, "Does William know?" "My secretary is attempting to notify him," he said, omitting the bit about the young lady at Shrewsbury. "He's at the Bodleian," she said. Reading Pet Track, she unwrapped the curtain cord from her hand and went out, no doubt, to telephone the Bodleian. Bettery stirred and murmured something dumbly, could not make out. He looked flushed and his breathing seemed more labored. "Bettery," he said. Bettery opened his eyes. "Where am I?" he said. Dunworthy glanced at the monitors. His fever was down 0.5 point, and he seemed more alert than before. "In infirmary," he said. "You collapsed in the lab at Brasednose while you were working the net. Do you remember?" "I remember feeling odd," he said. "Cold. I came to the pub to tell you I'd got the fix." A strange, frightened look came over his face. "You told me there was something wrong." Dunworthy said, "What was it? Was it the slippage?" "Something wrong," Bettery repeated. He tried to raise himself on his elbow. "What's wrong with me?" "Your old," Dunworthy said. "You have the flu." "Ill? I've never been ill." He struggled to sit up. "They died, didn't they?" "Who died?" "It killed them all." "Did you see someone bury?" "This is important. Did someone else have the virus?" "Virus," he said, and there was obvious relief in his voice. "Do I have a virus?" "Yes, a type of flu. It's not fatal. They've been giving you antimicrobials, and an analog's on the way. You'll be recovered in no time." "Do you know who you caught it from? Did someone else have the virus?" "No." He eased himself back down onto the pillow. "I thought, oh." He looked up in alarm at Dunworthy. "There's something wrong," he said desperately. "What is it?" He reached for the bell. "What's wrong?" His eyes were wide with fright. "It hurts." Dunworthy pushed the bell. The nurse and a house officer came in immediately and went through their routine again, prodding him with the icy stethoscope. He complained of being cold, Dunworthy said, and of something hurting. "Where does it hurt?" the house officer said, looking at the display here. Patrice said. He pressed his hand to the right side of his chest. He began to shiver again. "Lower right pleurisy." The house officer said. "Hurts when I breathe," Battery said through chattering teeth. "There's something wrong, something wrong." He hadn't meant the fakes. He had meant that something was wrong with him. He was how old? Kevin's age. They had begun giving routine rhinovirus antivirals. Nearly 20 years ago, it was entirely possible that, when he'd said he'd never been ill, he meant he'd never had so much as a cold. "Oxygen," the nurse said. "Not yet," the house officer said on his way out. "Start him onto 100 units of chlorofluorocin." The nurse laid Padre back down, attached a piggyback to the drip, watched Padre's temp drop for a minute and went out. Don Worthy looked out the window at the rainy night. I remember feeling odd, he had said, not a lot. Someone who'd never had a cold wouldn't know what to make of a fever or chills. He would only have known something was wrong, and would have left the net and hurried to the pub. To tell someone have to tell Dunworthy something wrong. Dunworthy took off his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. The disinfectant made them smart. He felt exhausted, he had said. He couldn't relax until he knew Kevin was all right. But Tree was asleep, the harshness of his breathing taken away by the impersonal magic of the doctors, and Kevin was asleep too, in a flea-ridden bed 700 years away, or wide awake, impressing the contempts with her table manners and her dirty fingernails, or kneeling on a filthy stone floor, telling her adventures into her hands. He must have dozed off. He dreamed he heard a telephone ringing. It was Finch. He told him the Americans were threatening to sue for insufficient supplies of lavatory paper, and that the vicar had called with a scripture. It's Matthew 11, Finch said. Waste leads to want, and at that point, the nurse opened the door and told him Mary needed him to meet her in casualties. He looked at his digital. It was for 20, but Dree was still asleep. Looking almost peaceful, the nurse met him outside with a disinfectant bottle and told him to take the elevator. The smell of disinfectant from his spectacles helped wake him up. By the time he reached the ground floor, he was almost awake. Mary was there, waiting for him in a mask and the rest of it. We've got another case, she said, handing him a bundle of SPGs. It's one of the detainees. It might be someone from that crowd of shoppers. I want you to try to identify her. He got into the garments as clumsily as the first time, nearly tearing the gown in his efforts to get the Velcro strips apart. There were dozens of shoppers on the high, he said, pulling the gloves on, and I was watching Burberry. I doubt that I could identify anyone on that street. I know, Mary said. She led the way down the corridor and through the door to casualties. It seemed like years since he'd been there. I had a cluster of people, all anonymous in paper, were wheeling a stretcher trolley in. The house officer, also papered, was taking information from a thin, frightened-looking woman in a wet Macintosh and matching rain hat. Her name is Beverly Breen, the woman told him in a faint voice. To 2-6 Clover Way, Surbiton. I knew something was wrong. She kept saying we needed to take the tube to Northampton. She was carrying an umbrella and a large handbag, and when the house officer asked for the patient's NHS number, she leaned the umbrella against the admissions desk, opened the handbag, and looked through it. She was just brought in from the tube station, complaining of headache and chills. Mary said she was in line to be assigned lodging. She signaled the medics to stop the stretcher trolley. And pulled the blanket back from the woman's neck and chest so he could get a better look at her, but he didn't need to. The woman in the wet Mac had found the card. She handed it to the officer, picked up the umbrella, the handbag, and a sheaf of vari-colored papers, and came over to the stretcher trolley carrying them. The umbrella was a large one. It was covered with lavender violets. Verdun collided with her on the way back to the net, Danworthy said. Are you absolutely certain? Mary said. He pointed at the woman's friend, who had sat down now and was filling out forms. I recognized the umbrella. What time was that? She said. Not positive. 1:30. What type of contact was it? Did he touch her? He ran straight into her, he said, trying to recall the scene. He collided with the umbrella, and then he told her he was sorry, and she yelled at him for a bit. He picked up the umbrella and handed it to her. Did he cough or sneeze? I can't remember. The woman was being wheeled into casualties. Mary stood up. I want to put in isolation. she said, and started after them. The woman's friend stood up, dropping one of the forms and clutching the others awkwardly to her chest. Isolation, she said frighteningly. What's wrong with her? Come with me, please, Mary said to her, and led her off somewhere to have her blood taken, and her friend's umbrellas spritzed with disinfectant before Dunworthy could ask her whether she wanted him to wait for her. He started to ask the registrar and then sat down, tiredly in one of the chairs against the wall. There was an inspirational brochure on the chair next to him. Its title was The Importance of a Good Night's Sleep. His neck hurt from his uncomfortable sleep on the camp stool, and his eyes were smarting again. He supposed he should go back up to Bardry's room, but he wasn't certain he had the energy to put on another set of SPGs. And he didn't think he could bear to wake Bardry and ask him who else would be shortly wheeled into casualties. With a temp of 39.5, at any rate Kivrin wouldn't be one of them. It was for 30 Bardry had collided with the woman with the lavender umbrella. At 1:30 that meant an incubation of 15 hours. And 15 hours ago Kivrin had been fully protected. Mary came back, her cap off and her mask dangling from her neck. Her hair was in disarray, and she looked as bone-weary as Dunworthy felt. I'm discharging Mrs. Gatson, she told the registrar. She's to be back here at 7 for a blood test. She came over to where Dunworthy was sitting. I'd forgotten all about her, she said, smiling. She was rather upset. She threatened to sue me for unlawful detention. She should get along well with my bell ringers. They're threatening to go to court over involuntary breach of contract. Mary ran her hand through her disordered hair. We got an ident from the World Influenza Center. On the influenza virus, she stood up, as if she had had a sudden infusion of energy. I could do with a cup of tea, she said. Come along. Dunworthy glanced at the registrar, who was watching them attentively, and hauled himself to his feet. I'll be in the surgical waiting room, Mary said to the registrar. Yes, doctor, the registrar said. I couldn't help overhearing your conversation, she said hesitantly. Mary stiffened. You told me you were discharging Mrs. Gadsden, and then I heard you mention the name William. And I was just wondering if Mrs. Gadsden is, by any chance, William Gadsden's mother. Yes, Mary said, looking puzzled. You're a friend of his, Dunworthy said, wondering if she would blush. Like the blonde student nurse, she did. I've come to know him rather well, this fact. He stayed up to read Petrarch, among other things, Dunworthy said. And while she was busy blushing, steered Mary past the no entrance, isolation area sign and down the corridor. What in heaven's name was that all about, she asked. Sickly. William is even more self-sufficient than we had at first assumed, he said, and opened the door to the waiting room. Mary flicked the light on and went over to the tea trolley. She shook the electric kettle and disappeared into the WC. With it he sat down. Someone had taken away the tray of blood testing equipment and moved the end table back to its proper place. But Mary's shopping bag was still sitting in the middle of the floor. He leaned forward and moved it over next to the chairs. Mary reappeared with the kettle. She bent and plugged it in. Did you have any luck discovering Bardry's contacts? She said, if you could call it that. He went to a Christmas dance in Headington last night. He took the tube both ways. How bad is it? Mary opened two tea packets and draped them over the cups. There's only powdered milk, I'm afraid. Do you know if he's had any contact recently with someone from the States? No. Why do you take sugar? How bad is it? She poured powdered milk into the cups. The bad news is that Bardry's very ill. She spooned in sugar. He had his seasonals through the university, which requires broader spectrum protection than the NHS. He should be completely protected against a 5-point shift and partially resistant to a 10-point shift. But he's exhibiting full influenza symptoms, which indicates a major mutation. The cattle was screaming, which means an epidemic. Yes, a pandemic, possibly if the WIC can't sequence the virus quickly, or the staff bolts or the quarantine doesn't hold. She unplugged the kettle and poured hot water into their cups. The good news is that the WIC thinks it's an influenza that originated in South Carolina. She brought a cup over to Dunworthy, in which case it's already been sequenced, and an analog and vaccine manufactured. It responds well to antimicrobials and symptomatic treatment, and it's not fatal. How long is its incubation period? 12 to 48 hours. She stood against the tea trolley and took a sip of tea. The WIC is sending blood samples to the CDC in Atlanta for matching, and they're sending their recommended course of treatment. When did Kevin check into infirmary? On Monday for antivirals. 3 o'clock. Mary said she was here until 9 the next morning. I kept her overnight to ensure she's got a good night's sleep. Padre says he didn't see her yesterday, Dunworthy said, but he could have had contact with her Monday before she went into infirmary. She'd need to have been exposed before her antiviral inoculation, and the virus have had a chance to replicate unchecked for her to be in danger, James, Mary said. Even if she did see Bertram Monday or Tuesday, she's in less danger of developing symptoms than you are. She looked seriously at him over her teacup. You're still worried over the fix, aren't you? He half shook his head. Bettery says he checked the apprentice's coordinates, and they were correct, and he'd already told Gilchrist. The slippage was minimal, he said, wishing Bettery had answered him when he asked him about the slippage. What else is there that can have gone wrong? Mary asked. I don't know. Nothing except that she's alone in the Middle Ages. Mary set her cup of tea down on the trolley. She may be safer there than here. We're going to have a good many ill patients. Influenza spreads like wildfire, and the quarantine will only make it worse. The medical staff are always the first exposed. If they come down with it, or the supply of antimicrobials gives out. This century could be the one that's a 10. She pushed her hand tiredly over her untidy hair. Sorry, it's the fatigue speaking. This isn't the Middle Ages after all. It's not even the 20th century. We have metabolizers and adjuvants, and if it's the South Carolina virus, we've an analog and a vaccine, but I'm still glad. Colin and Kivrin are safely out of this. Safely in the Middle Ages, Dunworthy said. Mary smiled at him with the cut throats. The door banged open. A tallish blond boy with large feet and a rugby duffel came in, dripping water on the floor. Colin, Mary said, so this is where you've got to. Colin said, I've been looking everywhere for you. Transcript from the Doomsday Book, Mr. Dunworthy. Ad adjuvantum me festina, make haste to help me. Book 2, in the bleak midwinter frosty wind made moan. Earth stood hard as iron water like a stone. Snow had fallen, snow on snow, snow on snow, in the bleak midwinter long ago. Christina Rossetti, Chapter 10, the fire was out. Kevin could still smell smoke in the room, but she knew it was from a fire burning in a hearth somewhere. It's no wonder, she thought. Chimneys didn't become extant in England until the late 14th century, and this is only 1320, and as soon as she had formed the thought, awareness of the rest of it came. I am in 1320, and I've been ill, I've had a fever. For a while she didn't think any further than that. It was peaceful just to lie there and rest. She felt worn out, as if she had come through some terrible ordeal that took all her strength. I thought they were trying to burn me at the stake. She thought. She remembered struggling against them, and the flames leaping up, licking at her hands, burning her hair. They had to cut off my hair, she thought, and wondered if that were a memory, or something she had dreamed. She was too tired to raise her hand to her hair. Too tired to even try to remember. I have been very ill, she thought. They gave me the last rites. There's naught to fear, he had said. You do but go home again. Requiescat in parche and slept. When she woke again, it was dark in the room, and a bell was ringing a long way off. She had the idea that it had been ringing for a long time, the way the lone bell had rung when she came through. But after a minute another one chimed in, and then one so close. It seemed to be just outside the window, drowning out the others as they rang, Matins Kevin thought, and seemed to remember them ringing like that before. A ragged out-of-tune chiming that matched the beating of her heart. But that was impossible. She must have dreamed it. She had dreamed they were burning her at the stake. She had dreamed they cut off her hair. She had dreamed the contempt, spoke a language she didn't understand. The nearest bell stopped. And the others went on for a while, as if glad of the opportunity to make themselves heard. And Kevin remembered that too. How long had she been here? It had been night, and now it was morning. It seemed like one night. But now she remembered the faces leaning over her. When the woman had brought her the cup, and again. When the priest had come in, and the cut throat. With him, she had been able to see them clearly, without the flicker of unsteady, kind light. And in between she remembered darkness, and the smoky light of tallow lamps, and the bells ringing and stopping and ringing again. She felt a sudden stab of panic. How long had she been lying here? What if she had been ill for weeks, and had already missed the rendezvous? But that was impossible. People weren't delirious for weeks, even if they had typhoid fever. And she couldn't have typhoid fever. She had had her inoculations. It was cold in the room. As if the fire had gone out in the night. She felt for the bed coverings and hands, came up out of the dark immediately, and pulled something soft over her shoulders. Thank you, Kevin said, and slept. The cold woke her again, and she had the feeling. She had only slept a few moments, though there was a little light in the room now. It came from a narrow window recessed in the stone wall. The window's shutters had been opened, and that was where the cold was coming from too. A woman was standing on tiptoe, on the stone seat under the window, fastening a cloth over the opening. She was wearing a black robe and a white wimple and coiffed, and for a moment Kevin thought, I'm in a nunnery, and then remembered that women in the 1300s covered their hair when they were married. Only unmarried girls wore their hair loose and uncovered. The woman didn't look old enough to be married, or to be a nun either. There had been a woman in the room while she was ill, but that woman had been much older when Kevin had clutched at her hands in her delirium. They had been rough and wrinkled, and the woman's voice had been harsh with age, though perhaps that had been part of the delirium too. The woman leaned into the light from the window. The white coif was yellowed, and it was not a robe but a kerchief like Kevin's, with a dark green surcoat over it. It was badly dyed. And looked like it had been made from a burlap sack. The weave so large Kevin could see it easily. Even in the dim light, she must be a servant then. But servants didn't wear linen wimples or carry bunches of keys, like the one that hung from the woman's belt. She had to be a person of some importance, the housekeeper perhaps. And this was a place of importance, probably not a castle, because the wall the bed lay up against wasn't stone. It was unfinished wood. But very likely, a manor house of at least the first order of nobility, a minor baron and possibly higher than that. The bed she was lying in was a real bed, with a raised wooden frame and hangings, and stiff linen sheets, not just a pallet. And the coverings were fur, The stone seat under the window had embroidered cushions on it. The woman tied the cloth to little projections of stone on either side of the narrow window, stepped down from the window seat, and leaned over to get something. Kevin couldn't see what it was because the bed hangings obstructed her view. They were heavy, almost like rugs, and had been pulled back and tied with what looked like rope. The woman straightened up again, holding a wooden bowl, and then catching her skirts up with her free hand, stepped onto the window seat and began brushing something thick onto the cloth. Oil, Kevin thought. No wax. Waxed linen used in place of glass in windows. Glass was supposed to have been common in 14th century manor houses. The nobility was supposed to have carried glass windows, along with the luggage and the furniture, when they traveled from house to house. I must get this on the order, Kevin thought, that some manor houses didn't have glass windows, and she raised her hands and pressed them together. But the effort of holding them up was too great, and she let them fall back onto the coverings. The woman glanced over toward the bed and then turned back to the window and went on painting the cloth with long, unconcerned strokes. I must be getting better, Kevin thought. She was right by the bed the whole time I was ill. She wondered again how long that time had been. I will have to find out, she thought. And then I must find the drop. It couldn't be very far. If this was the village she had intended to go to, the drop wasn't more than a mile away. She tried to remember how long the trip to the village had taken. It had seemed to take a long time. The cutthroat had put her on a white horse, and it had had bells on its harness. But he wasn't a cutthroat. He was a kind-looking young man with red hair. She would have to ask the name of the village she had been brought to, and hopefully it would be Skengate. But even if it wasn't, she would know from the name where she was in relation to the drop. And of course, as soon as she was a little stronger, they could show her where it was. What is the name of this village you have brought me to? She had not been able to think of the words last night, but that was because of the fever. Of course, she had no trouble now. Mr. Latimer had spent months on her pronunciation. They would certainly be able to understand in water. Loaned Emmy or even water, be this a holding. And even if there was some variation in local dialect, the interpreter would automatically correct it. What a place hast thou brought us to? Kevin said. The woman turned, looked startled. She stepped down from the window seat, still holding the bowl in one hand, and the brush in the other, only it wasn't a brush. Kivrin could see as she approached the bed. It was a squarish wooden spoon with a nearly flat bowl. Gotta be place our slaver, the woman said, holding spoon and bowl together in front of her. Bet not Augusta. The interpreter was supposed to translate what was said. Immediately, maybe Kevin's pronunciation was all off. So far off that the woman thought she was speaking a foreign language and was trying to answer her in clumsy French or German. What a place hast thou brought me, she said slowly so the interpreter would have time to translate. What she said, Wick London Bay a common lad o' Kaler, a Tringle or to Shorn and o' Six. Stronglanders speak for Equinot of the tallow breader. Lost charest lusty, a voice said. The woman turned around to look at the door. Kevin couldn't see, and another woman came in, much older. Her face under the cowl wrinkled, and her hands. The hands Kivrin remembered from her delirium, rough and old. She was wearing a silver chain and carrying a small leather chest. It looked like the casket Kivrin had brought through with her, but it was smaller and bound with iron instead of brass. She set the casket down on the window seat. Now speak of it, damn it, she remembered the voice. Too harsh and almost angry sounding. speaking to the woman by Kevin's bed. As if she were a servant, well, perhaps she was. And this was the lady of the house. Though her coif was no whiter, her dress no finer. But there weren't any keys at her belt, and now Kivrin remembered. That it wasn't the housekeeper who carried the keys, but the lady of the house, the lady of the manor, in yellowed linen and badly dyed burlap, which meant that Kivrin's dress was all wrong. As wrong as Latimer's pronunciations, as wrong as Dr. Aaron's assurances, that she would not get any medieval diseases. I had my inoculations, she murmured, and both women turned to look at her. Eliva Schwatword Istorofiandis, the older woman asked sharply. Was she the younger woman's mother, or her mother-in-law, or her nurse? Kevin had no idea, none of the words she'd said. Not even a proper name or a form of address. Separated itself out. Mitinka Wanda, Heistwixa Hodumla. The younger woman said, and the older one answered no. Neta Barchos Daruda. Nothing, shorter. Sentences were supposed to be easier to translate. But Kevin couldn't even tell whether she had said one word or several. The younger woman's chin and the tight quiff lifted angrily. Certition she davnum vul that I serios. She said sharply. Kevin wondered if they were arguing over what to do with her. She pushed on the coverlet with her weak hands, as if she could push herself away from them. And the young woman set down her bowl and spoon, and came immediately up beside the bed, speaking Yervaz de Gonzalez. She said, and it might be good morning, or are you feeling better? Or we're burning you at dawn for all Kevin knew. Perhaps her illness was keeping the interpreter from working. Perhaps when the fever went down, she would understand everything they said. The old woman knelt beside the bed, holding a small silver box at the end of the chain, between her folded hands, and began to pray. The young woman leaned forward to look at Kivrin's forehead, and then reached around behind her head, doing something that pulled at Kivrin's hair. And she realized they must have bandaged the wound on her forehead. She touched her hand to the cloth, and then put it on her neck, feeling for her tangled locks. But there was nothing there. Her hair ended in a ragged fringe just below her ears. Vamorsha Tyant, the young woman said wordlessly. Forder hont want soer. She was giving Kivrin some kind of explanation, though Kivrin couldn't understand it. And actually she did understand it. She had been very ill. So ill she had thought her hair was on fire. She remembered someone, the old woman, trying to grab at her hands, and her flailing wildly at the flames. They had had no alternative, and Kevin had hated the unwieldy mass of hair, and the endless time it took to brush it, had worried about how medieval women wore their hair, whether they braided it or not, and wondered how on earth she was going to get through to weeks without washing. She should be glad they had cut it off, but all she could think of was Joan of Arc, who had had short hair, whom they had burned at the stake. The young woman had drawn her hands back from the bandage and was watching Kivrin, looking frightened. Kivrin smiled at her a little quaveringly, and she smiled back. She had a gap where the teeth were missing, on the right side of her mouth, and the tooth next to the gap was brown, but when she smiled, she looked no older than a first-year student. She finished untying the bandage and laid it on the coverlet. It was the same yellowed linen as her coiffed, but torn into fraying strips and stained with brownish blood. There was more blood than Kivrin would have thought there would be. Mr. Gilchrist's wound must have started bleeding. Again, the woman touched Kevin's temple nervously, as if she wasn't sure what to do. Yakshu Hunkrit, she said, and put one hand behind Kevin's neck and helped her raise her head. Her head felt terribly light. That must be because of my hair, Kevin thought. The older woman handed the young one a wooden bowl, and she put it to Kevin's lips. Kevin sipped carefully at it, thinking confusedly. That it was the same bowl that had held the wax, it wasn't. And it wasn't the drink they'd given her before. It was a thin, grainy gruel, less bitter than the drink last night. With a greasy aftertaste. Lass Holden naive gross betrayal tried, the older woman said, her voice harsh with impatient criticism. Definitely her mother-in-law, Kevin thought. Shimotella's horvures, the young woman answered back mildly. The gruel tasted good. Kivrin tried to drink it all. But after only a few sips, she felt worn out. The young woman handed the bowl to the older one, who had come around to the side of the bed too, and eased Kivrin's head back down onto the pillow. She picked up the bloody bandage, touched Kivrin's temple again, as if she were debating whether to put the bandage back on again, and then handed it to the other woman, who set it and the bowl down on the chest that must be at the foot of the bed. The young woman said, smiling her gap-toothed smile, and there was no mistaking her tone, even though she couldn't make out the words at all. The woman had told her to go to sleep. She closed her eyes. Germil Schilosprach Nauer, the older woman said. And they left the room, shutting the heavy door behind them. Kevin repeated the words slowly to herself, trying to catch some familiar word. The interpreter was supposed to enhance her ability to separate out phonemes and recognize syntactic patterns, not just store Middle English vocabulary, but she might as well be listening to Serbo-Croatian. And maybe I am, she thought. Who knows where they brought me? I was delirious. Maybe the cutthroat put me on a boat and took me across the channel. She knew that wasn't possible. She remembered most of the night's journey, even though it had a disjointed, dreamlike quality to it. I fell off the horse, she thought, and a red-headed man picked me up, and we came past a church. She found trying to remember more about the direction they had traveled. They had headed into the woods, away from the thicket, and then came to a road. And the road forked, and that was where she had fallen off. If she could find the fork in the road, perhaps she could find the drop from there. The fork was only a little way from the tower. But if the drop was that close, she was in Scangate, and the women were speaking Middle English. But if they were speaking Middle English, why couldn't she understand them? Maybe I hit my head when I fell off the horse, and it's done something to the interpreter. She thought, but she had not hit her head. She had let go and slid down until she was sitting on the road. It's the fever, she thought. It's somehow keeping the interpreter from recognizing the words. It recognized the Latin, she thought, and a little knot of fear began to form in her chest. It recognized the Latin, and I can't be ill. I had my inoculations, she remembered suddenly. That her antiviral inoculation had itched and made a lump under her arm. But Dr. Ahrens had checked it just before she came through. Dr. Ahrens had said it was all right, and none of her other inoculations had itched. Except the plague inoculation. I can't have the plague, she thought. I don't have any of the symptoms. Plague victims had huge lumps under their arms, and on the insides of their thighs, they vomited blood. And the blood vessels under their skin ruptured and turned black. It wasn't the plague. But what was it, and how had she contracted it? She had been inoculated against every major disease extant in 1320, and anyway she hadn't been exposed to any disease. She had begun to have symptoms as soon as she came through. Before she had even met anyone, germs didn't just hover near a drop, waiting for someone to come through. They had to be spread by contact or sneezing or fleas. The plague had been spread by fleas. It's not the plague, she told herself, firmly. People who have the plague don't wonder if they have it. They're too busy dying. It wasn't the plague, the fleas that had spread. It lived on rats and humans, not out in the middle of a forest. And the Black Death hadn't reached England till 1348. It must be some medieval disease Dr. Orens hadn't known about. There had been all sorts of strange diseases in the Middle Ages. The King's Evil and St. Vitus's Dance, and unnamed fevers, it must be one of them. And it had taken her enhanced immune system a while to figure out what it was and begin fighting it. But now it had, and her temperature was down, and the interpreter would begin working. All she had to do was rest and wait and get better. Comforted by that thought, she closed her eyes again and slept. Someone was touching her. She opened her eyes. It was the mother-in-law. She was examining Kivrin's hands, turning them over and over again in hers, rubbing her chapped forefinger along the backs, scrutinizing the nails. When she saw Kivrin's eyes were open, she dropped her hands as if in disgust and said, "She worst of lip rise at least." But would that Rukin shock us full to nothing? Kevin had hoped that somehow while she slept, the interpreter's enhancers would have sorted and deciphered everything she'd heard. And she would wake to find the interpreter working. But their words were still unintelligible. It sounded a little like French, with its dropped endings and delicate, rising inflections, but Kivrin knew Norman French. Mr. Dunworthy had made her learn it, and she couldn't make out any of the words. "Hast thou no depress?" the old woman said. It sounded like a question, but all French sounded like a question. The old woman took hold of Kivrin's arm with one rough hand and put her other arm around her, as if to help her up. "I'm too ill to get up," Kivrin thought. Why would she make me get up to be questioned? To be burned? The younger woman came into the room. Carrying a footed cup, she set it down on the window seat and came to take Kivrin's other arm, Estantina to Nogrosa. She asked, smiling her gap-toothed smile at Kevin, and Kevin thought, maybe they're taking me to the bathroom, and made an effort to sit up and put her legs over the side of the bed. She was immediately dizzy. She sat, her bare legs dangling over the side of the high bed, waiting for it to pass. She was wearing her linen shift and nothing else. She wondered where her clothes were. At least they'd let her keep her shift. People in the Middle Ages didn't usually wear anything to bed. People in the Middle Ages didn't have indoor plumbing either, she thought, and hoped she wouldn't have to go outside to a privy. Castles sometimes had enclosed guard robes or corners over a shaft that had to be cleaned out at the bottom. But this wasn't a castle. The young woman put a thin, folded blanket around Kevin's shoulders like a shawl, and they both helped her off the bed. The planked wooden floor was icy. She took a few steps and was dizzy all over again. I'll never make it all the way outside, she thought. Wouldn't save out na droyos da Jordan, the old woman said sharply. And Kevin thought she recognized Jordan, the French for garden. But why would they be discussing gardens? The young woman said, putting her arm around Kevin and draping Kevin's arm over her shoulders. The old woman gripped her other arm with both hands. She scarcely came to Kevin's shoulder, and the young woman didn't look like she weighed more than 90 pounds, but between them, they walked her to the end of the bed. Kevin got dizzier with every step. I'll never make it all the way outside, she thought, but they had stopped at the end of the bed. There was a chest there, a low wooden box with a bird, or possibly an angel carved roughly into the top. On it lay a wooden basin full of water, the bloody bandage that had been around Kevin's forehead, and a smaller empty bowl. Kevin, concentrating on not falling over, didn't realize what it was until the old woman said, Soon na morto upon your seta, and pantomimed lifting her heavy skirts and sitting on it. A chamber pot, Kivrin thought gratefully. Mr. Dunworthy, chamber pots were extant in country village. Manor houses in 1320, she nodded to show that she understood, and let them ease her down onto it, though she was so dizzy. She had to grab at the heavy bed hangings to keep from falling, and her chest hurt so badly when she tried to stand up again that she doubled over. Misery, the old woman shouted toward the door. Misery, come out here, help me, and the inflection indicated clearly that she was calling someone, Marjorie Mary, to come and help, but no one appeared. So perhaps she was wrong about that too. She straightened a little, testing the pain, and then tried to stand up, and the pain had lessened a little. But they still had to nearly carry her back to the bed, and she was exhausted. By the time she was back under the bed coverings, she closed her eyes. Slap on Pondonu pa datan, the young woman said, and she had to be saying rest or go to sleep, but she still couldn't decipher it. The interpreter's broken, she thought, and a little knot of panic started to form again, worse than the pain in her chest. It can't be broken, she told herself. It's not a machine. It's a chemical syntax, a memory enhancer. It can't be broken. It could only work with words in its memory though, and obviously Mr. Latimer's Middle English was useless. One that April with his shoe salt. Mr. Latimer's pronunciations were so far off. The interpreter couldn't recognize what it was hearing as the same words, but that didn't mean it was broken. It only meant it had to collect new data, and the few sentences it had heard so far weren't enough. It recognized the Latin, she thought, and the panic stabbed at her again, but she resisted it. It had been able to recognize the Latin because the rite of extreme unction was a set piece. She had already known what words should be there. The words the women spoke weren't a set piece, but they were still decipherable. Proper names, forms of address, nouns and verbs and prepositional phrases would appear in set positions that repeated again and again. They would separate themselves out rapidly, and the interpreter would be able to use them as the key to the rest of the code. And what she needed to do now was collect data, listen to what was said without even trying to understand it, and let the interpreter work. Sin kawara hu wendus mutala, the young woman asked. Got tullen wordus, the old woman said. A bell began to ring far away. Kevin opened her eyes. Both women had turned to look at the window, even though they couldn't see through the linen. Byrick Park Ganson, the young woman said. The old woman didn't answer. She was staring at the window, as if she could see past the stiffened linen. Her hands clasped in front of her as if in prayer. 8 o'clock is the favorable brown, the young woman said, and in spite of her resolution, Kevin tried to make it into, it is time for Vespers, or there is the Vespers bell, but it wasn't Vespas. The bell went on tolling, and no other bells joined in. She wondered if it was the bell she had heard before, ringing all alone in the late afternoon. The old woman turned abruptly away from the window. Nay, Louis, it's bad. De Wolfen. She picked up the chamber pot from the wooden chest. Go on with this bed. There was a sudden scuffling outside the door, a sound of footsteps running upstairs, and a child's voice crying, "Murder is murder." A little girl burst into the room, blonde braids and cap strings flying, nearly colliding with the old woman in the chamber pot. The child's round face was red and smeared with tears. You're allowed loose for shamaness, the old woman growled at her, lifting the treacherous bowl out of reach. You oma nana run sanu. The little girl paid no attention to her. She ran straight at the young woman, sobbing. Will someone hot my schmiter, motor? Kivrin gasped. Motor, that had to be mother, The little girl held up her arms and her mother. Oh yes, definitely mother picked her up. She fastened her arms around her mother's neck and began to howl. Shin hush sh, the mother said that Gustrol's ag Kevin thought a hacking German g, Shagness, still holding her. The mother sat down on the window seat. She wiped at the tears with the tail of her quiff. Spekken der Hauser befalls Agnes. Yes, definitely Agnes. And Spekken was Tal. Tell me what happened. She was my swatter, Agnes said, pointing at another child, who had just come into the room. The second girl was considerably older. 9 or 10 at least. She had long brown hair that hung down her back and was held in place by a dark blue kerchief. Ik so een news. She said the picture went in gown distress, and there was no mistaking that combination of affection and contempt. She didn't look like the blonde little girl, but Kivrin was willing to bet this dark-haired girl was the little one's older sister. She picked her unaccounted Iris mother. Mother again, and she was she, and picked her must be foul. It sounded French, but the key to this was German. The pronunciations, the constructions were German. Kivrin could almost feel it click into place. Na konfiho das Louis, the old woman said. Shart now wonders who it terrors ben for naught, misgained a pity. Hannigan for bloaty, the woman said, but Kivrin couldn't hear her. She was hearing instead the interpreter's translation. Still clumsy and obviously more than a beat behind, but a translation don't pamper her. Eloise, she is not injured. Her tears are but to get your attention. And the mother, whose name was Eloise, her knee is bleeding. Rosamond Brangwend Ovis from Krolfra, she said, pointing at the foot of the bed. And the interpreter was right behind her. Rosamond, fetch me the cloth on the chest. The 10-year-old moved immediately toward the trunk. At the foot of the bed, the older girl was Rosamond, and the little one was Agnes. And the impossibly young mother in her wimple and coiffed was Eloise. Rosamond held out a frayed cloth. That must surely be the one Eloise had taken off Kivrin's forehead. Touch it not, Agnes screamed. And Kivrin wouldn't have even needed the interpreter. For that one, it was still far more than a beat behind. I would but tie a cloth to stop the bleeding, Eloise said, taking the rag from Rosamond. Agnes tried to push it away. The cloth will not. There was a blank space, as if the interpreter didn't know a word. And then you, Agnes, the word was obviously hurt or harm. And Kevin wondered if the interpreter had not had the word in its memory, and why it couldn't have come up with an approximation. From context, we'll pronounce, Agnes shouted, and the interpreter echoed it. Well, and then the blank again, the space must be, so that she could hear the actual word and make her own guess at its meaning. It wasn't a bad idea, but the interpreter was so far behind the space that Kevin couldn't hear the word she was intended to. If the interpreter did this every time, it didn't recognize a word, she was in serious trouble. It will pronounce, Agnes wailed, pushing her mother's hand away from her knee. It will pain, the interpreter whispered, and Kevin felt relieved that it had managed to come up with something, even though to pain was scarcely a verb. How came you to fall? Eloise asked to distract Agnes. She was running up the stairs. Rosamond said she was running to give you the news that had come. The interpreter left a space again, but Kivrin caught the word, this time Garwin, which was probably a proper name, and the interpreter had apparently reached the same conclusion, because by the time Agnes had shrieked, I would have told Mother Garwin had come. The interpreter included it in the translation. I would have told, Agnes said, really crying now, and buried her face against her mother, who promptly took advantage of the opportunity to tie the bandage around Agnes's knee. You can tell me now, she said. Agnes shook her buried head. You tie the bandage too loosely. Daughter-in-law, the older woman said, it will but fall away. The bandage looked tight enough to Kivrin, and obviously any attempt to bind the wound tighter would result in renewed screams. The old woman was still holding the chamber pot in both hands. Kivrin wondered why she didn't go empty it. "SH, Eloise said, rocking the little girl gently and patting her back. I would fain have you tell me pride goes before a fall," the old woman said, seemingly determined to make Agnes cry again. "You were to blame that you fell. You should not have run on the stairs. Was Garwin riding a white mare?" Eloise asked. A white mare? Kevin wondered if Garwin could be the man who had helped her onto his horse and brought her to the manor. "Nay," Agnes said in a tone that indicated her mother had made some sort of joke. "He was riding his own black stallion Gringolet, and he rode up to me and said, 'Good Lady Agnes, I would speak with your mother. Rosamond, your sister was hurt because of your carelessness.'" The old woman said she hadn't succeeded in upsetting Agnes, so she decided to go after some other victim. "Why were you not tending her?" "I was at my broderie," Rosamond said, looking to her mother for support. Maisry was to keep watch over her. Maisie went out to see Garwin, Agnes said, sitting up on her mother's lap, and dally with the stable boy. The old woman said she went to the door and shouted, "Maisie Masonry." That was the name the old woman had called out before. And now the interpreter wasn't even leaving spaces when it came to proper names. Kevin didn't know who Maisry was, probably a servant. But if the way things were going was any indication, Maisry was going to be in a lot of trouble. The old woman was determined to find a victim. And the missing Masri seemed perfect. "Masri," she shouted again, and the name echoed. Rosamond took the opportunity to go and stand beside her mother. "Garwin bade us tell you. He begged leave to come and speak with you." "Waits he below?" Eloise asked. "Nay, he went first to the church to speak of the lady with Father ROC. Pride goes before a fall." The interpreter was obviously getting overconfident. Father Rolf, perhaps, or Father Peter. Obviously not Father Rock. Why went he to speak to Father Roach? The old woman demanded, coming back into the room. Kevin tried to hear the real word under the maddening whisper of the translation. Roach, the French word for rock. "Father Roach, mayhap he has found somewhat of the lady," Eloise said, glancing at Kivrin. It was the first indication she or anyone had given that they remembered Kivrin was in the room. Kevin quickly closed her eyes to make them think she was asleep, so they would go on discussing her. "Garwin rode out this morning to seek the ruffians," Eloise said. Kevin opened her eyes to slits, but she was no longer looking at her. "Mayhap he has found them," she bent and tied the dangling strings of Agnes's linen cap. "Agnes, go to the church with Rosamond and tell Garwin we would speak with him in the hall. The lady sleeps, we must not disturb her." Agnes darted for the door, shouting, "I would be the one to tell him, Rosamond. Rosamond, let your sister tell." Eloise called after them, "Agnes, do not run." The girls disappeared out the door and down the invisible stairs, obviously running. "Rosamond is near grown," the old woman said. "This is not seemly for her to run after your husband's men. Ill will come of your daughters being untended. You would do wisely to send to Oxenford for a nurse." "No," Eloise said, with a firmness Kevin wouldn't have guessed at. "Maisry can watch over them. Maisry is not fit to watch sheep. We should not have come from Bath in such haste. Certes, we could have waited till something." The interpreter left a gap again, and Kevin didn't recognize the phrase, but she had caught the important facts. They had come from Bath, they were near Oxford. Let go and fetch a nurse and a leech woman to see to the lady. We will send for no one, Eloise said. To another place name the interpreter couldn't manage. Lady Valta has repute with injuries, and she would gladly lend us one of her waiting women. For a nurse, no, Eloise said, we will tend ourselves. Father Roach, she said contemptuously, he knows naught of medicine, but I understand everything. He said Kevin thought she remembered his quiet voice, chanting the last rites, his gentle touch on her temples, her palms the solace of her feet. He had told her not to be afraid and asked her name and held her hand, if the lady is of noble birth. The older woman said, would you have it told? You let an ignorant village priest tend her, Lady of Gold. We will send for no one. Eloise said, and for the first time, Kevin realized she was afraid. My husband bade us keep here till he come. We had sooner have come with us. You know he could not, Eloise said. He will come when he can. I must go to speak with Garwin, she said, walking past the old woman to the door. Garwin told me he would search the place where first he found the lady to seek for signs of her attackers. Mayhap he has found somewhat that will tell us what she is. The place where first he found the lady, Gawain was the man who had found her. The man with the red hair and the kind face, who had helped her onto his horse and brought her here. That much at least she hadn't dreamed. Though she must have dreamed the white horse. He had brought her here, and he knew where the drop was. Wait, Kevin said. She pushed herself up against the pillows. Wait, please. I would speak with Garwin. The women stopped. Eloise came around beside the bed looking alarmed. I would speak with the man called Garwin, Kevin said carefully, waiting before each word until she had the translation. Eventually the process would be automatic, but for now she thought the word, and then waited till the interpreter translated it, and repeated it out loud. I must discover this place where he found me. Eloise laid a hand on Kivrin's forehead, and Kivrin brushed it impatiently away. I would speak with Garwin, she said. She has no fever in Miani, Eloise said to the old woman. And yet she tries to speak. Though she knows we cannot understand her, she speaks in a foreign tongue. Emily said, making it sound criminal. Perhaps she is a French spy. I'm not speaking French, Kevin said. I'm speaking Middle English. Maybe it is Latin, Eloise said. Father Roach said she spoke in Latin when he shrove her. Father Roach can say his part in Noster, Lady Amia, he said. We should send to the unrecognizable name again. Kirky Corsi. I would speak with Garwin, Kevin said in Latin. Nay. Eloise said, we will await my husband. The old woman wheeled angrily, slopping the contents of the chamber pot onto her hand. She wiped it off onto her skirt and went out the door, slamming it shut behind her. Eloise started after her. Kivrin grabbed at her hands. Why don't you understand me? She said, I understand you. I have to talk to Garwin. He has to tell me where the drop is. Eloise disengaged Kevin's hand there. You mustn't cry, she said. Kindly try to sleep. You must rest so you can go home. Transcript from the Doomsday Book. I'm in a lot of trouble, Mr. Dunworthy. I don't know where I am and I can't speak the language. Something's gone wrong with the interpreter. I can understand some of what the contempts say, but they can't understand me at all. And that's not the worst of it. I've caught some sort of disease. I don't know what it is. It's not the plague, because I don't have any of the right symptoms. And because I'm getting better. And I had a plague inoculation. I had all my inoculations, and T-cell enhancement and everything. But one of them must not have worked, or else this is some Middle Ages disease. There aren't any inoculations for. The symptoms are headache and fever and dizziness. And I get a pain in my chest when I try to move. I was delirious for a while, which is why I don't know where I am. A man named Garwin brought me here on his horse. but I don't remember very much about the trip, except that it was dark and it seemed to take hours. I'm hoping I was wrong, and the fever made it seem longer. And I'm in Miss Montoya's village, after all. It could be Skengate. I remember a church. And I think this is a manor house. I'm in a bedroom or a solar. And it's not just a loft because there are stairs, so that means the house of a minor baron. At least there's a window, and as soon as the dizziness subsides, I'll climb up on the window seat and see if I can see the church. It has a bell. It rang for Vespers just now. The one at Miss Montoya's village didn't have a bell tower. And that makes me afraid I'm not in the right place. I know we're fairly close to Oxford, because one of the contempts talked about fetching a doctor from there. It's also close to a village called Kersey or Corsey, which is not one of the villages on the map of Miss Montoya's I memorized. But that could be the name of the landowner, because of being out of my head. I'm not sure of my temporal location either. I've been trying to remember, and I think I've only been ill 2 days. But it might be more, and I can't ask them what day it is, because they don't understand me, and I can't get out of bed without falling over. And they've cut my hair off, and I don't know what to do. What happened? Why won't the interpreter work? Why didn't the T-cell enhancement? Break. There's a rat under my bed. I can hear it scrabbling in the dark. Chapter 11. They couldn't understand her. Kevin had tried to communicate with Eloise, to make her understand, but she had merely smiled kindly, uncomprehendingly, and told Kevin to rest. Please, Kevin had said, as Eloise started for the door. Don't leave, this is important. Gavin is the only one who knows where the drop is. Sleep. Eloise said, I will be back in a little. You have to let me see him. Kevin said desperately, but Eloise was already nearly to the door. I don't know where the drop is. There was a clattering on the stairs. Eloise opened the door and said, Agnes, I bade you go tell. She stopped in mid-sentence and took a step back. She did not look frightened or even upset, but her hand on the lintel jerked a little, as if she would have slammed the door, and Kevin's heart began to pound. This is it, she thought wildly. They've come to take me to the stake. Good morning, my lady, a man's voice said. Your daughter Rosamond told me I would find you in hall. But I did not. He came into the room. Kevin couldn't see his face. He was standing at the foot of the bed, hidden from her by the hangings. She tried to shift her head so she could see him, but the movement made her head spin violently. She lay back down. I thought I would find you with the wounded lady, the man said. He was wearing a padded jerkin and leather hose, and a sword. She could hear it clank as he took a step forward. How does she? She fares better today, Alois said. My husband's mother has gone to brew her a decoction of woundwort for her injuries. She had taken a hand from the door, and his comment about your daughter. Rosamond surely meant that this was Garwin, the man she had sent to look for Kevin's attackers. But Eloise had taken 2 more steps backward as he spoke, and her face looked guarded, weary. The thought of danger flickered through Kevin's mind again, and she wondered suddenly if she might have not dreamed. Mr. Dunworthy's cutthroat, after all. If that man with his cruel face might be Gavin, found you aught that might tell us of the lady's identity, Alois said carefully. Nay, he said. Her goods had all been stolen and the horses taken. I hoped a lady might tell me somewhat of her attackers, how many there were, and from what direction they came upon her. I fear she cannot tell you anything, Eloise said. Is she mute then, he said, and moved so she could see him. He was not so tall as Kevin remembered him, standing over her, and his hair looked less red and more blonde in the daylight, but his face still looked as kind as when he had sat on his horse, his black horse Gringolet. After he had found her in the clearing, he was not the cutthroat she had dreamed. The cutthroat conjured him out of her delirium and Mr. Dunworthy's fears, along with the white horse and the Christmas carols. And she must be misunderstanding Eloise's reactions. The way she'd misunderstood, they're getting her up to use the chamber pot. She's not mute, but speaks in some strange tongue I do not know. Eloise said, I fear her injuries have addled her wits. She came around to the side of the bed, and Garwin followed her. Good lady. I have brought my husband's priv, Garwin. Good day, my lady. Garwin said, speaking slowly and over distinctly, as if he thought Kivrin were deaf. It was he who found you in the woods, Alois said. Where in the woods? Kevin thought desperately. I am pleased that your wounds are healing, Garwin said, emphasizing every word. Can you tell me of the men who attacked you? I don't know if I can tell you anything, she thought, afraid to speak, for fear he wouldn't understand her either. He had to understand her. He knew where the drop was. How many men were there? Garwin said. Were they on horseback? Where did you find me? She thought, emphasizing the words the way Garwin had. She waited for the interpreter to work out the whole sentence, listening carefully to the intonations, checking them against the language lessons Mr. Dunworthy had given her. Garwin and Eloise were waiting, watching her intently. She took a deep breath. Where did you find me? They exchanged quick glances, his surprised, hers saying plainly, you see. She spoke thus that night. He said, I thought it was her injury that made her speak so. And so I do, Eloise said. My husband's mother thinks she is of France. He shook his head. It is not French she speaks. He turned back to Kevin. Good lady, he said. Nearly shouting, came you from another land? Yes, Kevin thought. Another land, and the only way back is the drop, and only you know where it is. Where did you find me? She said again. Her goods were all taken, Garwin said. But her wagon was of rich make, and she had many boxes. Eloise nodded. I fear she is of high birth and her people seeking her. In what part of the woods did you find me? Kevin said, her voice rising. We are upsetting her, Eloise said. She leaned over Kivrin and patted her hand. She take your rest. She moved away from the bed and Garwin followed. Would you have me ride to Bath to Lord Guion? Garwin said, out of sight behind the hangings. Eloise stepped back, the way she had when he first came in, as if she were afraid of him, but they had stood side by side at the bed, their hands nearly touching. They had spoken together like old friends. This weariness must be coming from something else. Would you have me bring your husband? Garwin said. Nay, Alois said, looking down at her hands. My lord has enough to worry him. And he cannot leave until the trial is finished. And he bade you stay with us and guard us. By your leave then, I will return to the place where the lady was set upon, and search further. Eloise said, still not looking at him. In their haste, some token may have fallen to the ground nearby. That will tell us of her, the place where the lady was set upon. Given recited under her breath, trying to hear his words, under the interpreter's translation, and memorize them. The place where I was set upon. I will take my leave and ride out again. Garwin said. Eloise looked up at him. Now she said, it grows dark. Show me the place where I was set upon. Kevin said, I do not fear the dark, Lady Eloise. He said and strode out, the sword clanking. Take me with you, Kevin said, but it was no use. They were already gone, and the interpreter was broken. She had deceived herself into thinking it was working. She had understood what they were saying. Because of the language lessons Mr. Dunworthy had given her, not because of the interpreter, and perhaps she was only deceiving herself. That she understood them, perhaps. The conversation had not been about who she was at all, but about something else altogether, finding a missing sheep or putting her on trial. The Lady Eloise had shut the door when they went out, and Kivrin couldn't hear anything. Even the tolling bell had stopped. And the light from the waxed linen was faintly blue. It grows dark. Darwin had said he was going to ride back to the drop. If the window overlooked the courtyard, she might at least be able to see which way he rode out. It is not far, he had said. If she could just see the direction he rode, she could find the drop herself. She pushed herself up in the bed, but even that much exertion made the pain in her chest stab again. She put her feet over the side, but the action made her dizzy. She lay back against the pillow and closed her eyes. Dizziness and fever and a pain in the chest. What were those symptoms of smallpox? Started out with fever and chills, and the pox didn't appear until the second or third day. She lifted her arm up to see if there were the beginnings of the pox. She had no idea how long she'd been ill, but it couldn't be smallpox, because the incubation period was 10 to 21 days. 10 days ago she had been in hospital in Oxford, where the smallpox virus had been extinct. For nearly 100 years, she had been in hospital, getting inoculated against all of them: smallpox, typhoid fever, cholera, plague. So how could it be any of them? And if it wasn't any of them, what was it? St. Vitus's dance. She had told herself that before, that this was something she had not been vaccinated against, but she had had her immune system augmented to fight off any infection. There was a sound of running on stairs. Murder. A voice that she already recognized as Agnes's shouted. Rosamond waited not. She didn't burst into the room with quite as much violence, because the heavy door was shut and she had to push it open. But as soon as she had squeezed through, she raced for the window seat, wailing, "Mother, I would have told Garwin." She sobbed and then stopped when she saw her mother wasn't in the room. The tears stopped too. Kevin noticed Agnes stood by the window for a minute, as if she were debating whether to try this scene at a later time, and then ran back to the door. Halfway there she spied Kevin and stopped again. "I know who you are," she said, coming around to the side of the bed. She was scarcely tall enough to see over the bed. Her cap strings had come undone again. "You are the Lady Garwin found in the wood." Kevin was afraid that her answer, garbled as the interpreter obviously made it, would frighten the little girl. She pushed herself up a little against the pillows and nodded. "What befell your hair?" Agnes asked. "Did the robbers steal it?" Kevin shook her head, smiling at the odd idea. "Mary says the robbers stole your tongue." Agnes said. She pointed at Kevin's forehead. "Hurt you your head?" Kevin nodded. "I hurt my knee," she said, and tried to pick it up with both hands so Kevin could see the dirty bandage. The old woman was right. It was already slipping. She could see the wound under it. Kevin had supposed it was just a skin knee, but the wound looked fairly deep. Agnes tottered, let go of the knee, and leaned against the bed again. "Will you die?" "I don't know," Kevin thought, thinking of the pain in her chest. The mortality rate for smallpox had been 75% in 1320, and her augmented immune system wasn't working. "Brother Hubert died," Agnes said wisely, "and Gilbert. He fell from his horse. I saw him, his head was all red." Rosamond said Brother Hubert died of the blue sickness. Gibrin wondered what the blue sickness was. Choking perhaps, or apoplexy, and if he was the chaplain that Eloise's mother-in-law was so eager to replace. It was usual for noble households to travel with their own priest. Father Roach was apparently the local priest, probably uneducated and possibly even illiterate. Though she had understood his Latin perfectly well, and he had been kind, he had held her hand and told her not to be afraid. There are nice people in the Middle Ages, Mr. Dunworthy, she thought. Father Roach and Eloise and Agnes, my father said he would bring me a magpie. When he comes from Bath, Agnes said, Adeliza has a tercel, she lets me hold him sometimes. She held her bent arm up and out, the dimpled fist closed. As if a falcon were perched on her imaginary gauntlet. I have a hound. What is your hound's name? Kevin asked. I call him Blackie, Agnes said, though Kevin was certain. That was only the interpreter's version. More likely she had said Blackaman or Blacken. He is black. Have you a hound? Kevin was too surprised to answer. She had spoken and made herself understood. Agnes hadn't even acted like her pronunciation was unusual. She had spoken without thinking about the interpreter or waiting for it to translate. And perhaps that was the secret. Nay, I have no hound, she said, finally trying to duplicate what she'd done before. I will teach my magpie to talk. I will teach him to say good morrow, Agnes. Where is your hound? Kevin said, trying again. The words sounded different to her, lighter with that murmuring French inflection she had heard in the woman's speech. Do you wish to see Blackie? He's in the stable, Agnes said. It sounded like a direct response. But the way Agnes talked, it was difficult to tell. She might simply have been volunteering information. To be sure, Kevin would have to ask her. Something completely off the subject, and something with only one answer. Agnes was stroking the soft fur of the bed covering and humming a toneless little tune. What is your name? Kevin asked, trying to let the interpreter control her words. It translated her modern sentence into something like, how are you, Eclepid, which he was not sure was correct. But Agnes didn't hesitate. Agnes, the little girl, said promptly, my father says, I may have a trestle when I am old enough to ride a mare. I have a pony. She stopped stroking the fur, propped her elbows on the edge of the bed, and rested her chin in her little hands. I know your name, she said, sounding smugly pleased. It's Catherine. What? Kevin said blankly. Catherine? How did they come up with Catherine? Her name was supposed to be Isabel. Was it possible that they thought they knew who she was? Rosamond said none knew your name. She went on looking smug. But I heard Father Roach tell Garwin you were called Catherine. Rosamond said you couldn't speak, but yet you can. Kevin had a sudden image of the priest bending over her, his face obscured by the flames that seemed constantly in front of her. Saying in Latin, what is your name, that you might be shriven, and she trying to form the word, though her mouth was so dry she could hardly speak, afraid she would die, and they would never know what had happened to her. Are you called Catherine? Agnes was demanding, and she could hear the little girl's voice clearly, under the interpreter's translation. It sounded just like Kivrin, Kevin said, and felt like crying. Blackie has a, Agnes said. The interpreter didn't catch the word correct. Chevrette. It's red. Do you wish to see it? And before Kivrin could stop her, she went running out through the still partly open door. Kevin waited, hoping she would come back, and that a carrot wasn't alive. Wishing she had asked where she was and how long she'd been here. Though Agnes was probably too young to know. She looked no more than 3, though of course, she would be much smaller than a modern 3-year-old. 5 then, or possibly 6, I should have asked her how old she was. Kevin thought, and then remembered that she might not know that either. Joan of Arc hadn't known how old she was when the inquisitors asked her at her trial. At least she could ask questions, Kevin thought. The interpreter was not broken after all. It must have been temporarily stymied by the strange pronunciations, or affected somehow by her fever, but it was all right now. And Garwin knew where the drop was and could show it to her. She sat up straighter among the pillows, so she could see the door. The effort hurt her chest and made her dizzy, and her head ached. She anxiously felt her forehead and then her cheeks. They felt warm, but that could be because her hands were cold. It was icy in the room and on her excursion to the chamber pot. She hadn't seen any sign of a brazier, or even a warming pan, had warming pans been invented yet. They must have otherwise. How would people have survived the Little Ice Age? It was so cold. She was beginning to shiver. Her fever must be going back up. Were they supposed to come back? In History of Med she had read about fevers breaking. And after that the patient was weak. But the fever didn't come back, did it? Of course it did. What about malaria, shivering, headache, sweats? Recurring fever, of course they came back. Well, it obviously wasn't malaria. Malaria had never been endemic to England. Mosquitoes didn't live in Oxford in midwinter. And never had, and the symptoms were wrong. She hadn't experienced any sweating. And the shivering she was having was due to fever. Typhus-produced headache and a high fever. And it was transmitted by body lice and rat fleas, both of which were endemic to England in the Middle Ages, and probably endemic to the bed she was lying on. But the incubation period was too long, nearly 2 weeks. Typhoid fever's incubation period was only a few days, and it caused headache, aching in the limbs, and high fever too. She didn't think it was a recurring fever, but she remembered it was normally highest at night. So that must mean it went down during the day, and then up again in the evening. Kevin wondered what time it was. Eloise had said it grows dark, and the light from the linen-covered window was faintly blue, but the days were short. In December it might only be mid-afternoon. She felt sleepy, but that was no sign. Either she had slept off and on all day. Drowsiness was a symptom of typhoid fever. She tried to remember the others. From Dr. Aaron's short course in medieval medicine. Nosebleeds, coated tongue, rose-colored rash. The rash wasn't supposed to appear until the 7th or 8th day, but Kevin pulled her shift up and looked at her stomach and chest. No rash, so it couldn't be typhoid or smallpox. With smallpox, the pox started appearing by the 2nd or 3rd day. She wondered what had happened to Agnes. Perhaps someone had belatedly had the good sense to bar her from the sick room. Or perhaps the unreliable Mary was actually watching her. Or more likely, she had stopped to see her puppy in the stable and forgotten she was going to show her Chova to Kevin. The plague started out with a headache and a fever. It can't be the plague, Kevin thought. You don't have any of the symptoms. Buboes that grew to the size of oranges. A tongue that swelled till it filled the whole mouth. Subcutaneous hemorrhages that turned the whole body black. You don't have the plague. It must be some sort of flu. It was the only disease that came on so suddenly. And Dr. Aarons had been upset over Mr. Gilchrist moving the date up because the antivirals wouldn't take full effect until the 15th, and she'd only have partial immunity. It had to be the flu. What was the treatment for the flu? Antivirals, rest. Fluids. Well then rest, she told herself, and closed her eyes. She did not remember falling asleep, but she must have, because the 2 women were in the room again talking, and Kevin had no memory of their having come in. What said Gowan? The old woman said. She was doing something with a bowl and a spoon, mashing the spoon against the side of it. The iron-bound casket sat open beside her, and she reached into it, pulled out a small cloth bag, sprinkled the contents into the bowl, and stirred it again. He found naught among her belongings that might tell us the lady's origins. Her goods had all been stolen, the chest broken open and emptied of all that might identify her. But he said her wagon was of rich make. Certes, she is of good family, and certes, her family searches for her, the old woman said. She had set down the bowl and was tearing cloth. With a loud ripping sound, "We must send to Oxenford and tell them she lies safe with us." "No," Eloise said, and Kevin could hear the resistance in her voice. "Not to Oxenford. What have you heard?" "I have heard naught," Alois said, "but that my lord bade us keep here. He will be here within the week if all goes well." If all had gone well, he would have been here now. The trial had scarce begun. Mayhap he's on his way home even now. Oh, mayhap, another one of those untranslatable names. Torquil waits to be hanged of my son with him. He should not have meddled in such a matter. He is a friend and guiltless of the charges. He is a fool, and my son more fool, for testifying on his behalf. A friend would have bade him leave Bath. She ground the spoon into the side of the bowl again. "I have need of mustard for this," she said, and stepped to the door. "Mary," she called, and went back to tearing the cloth. Found Garwin, or to the ladies' attendants. Eloise sat down on the window seat. No, nor of their horses nor hers. A girl with a pockmarked face and greasy hair hanging over it came in. Surely this couldn't be Maisie, who dallied with stable boys. Instead of watching her charges, she bent her knee in a curtsy that was more of a stumble, and said, "What would you laver to my inn?" "Oh no." Kevin thought, what's wrong with the interpreter? "Now fetch me the pot of mustard from the kitchen." And tarry not, the old woman said, and the girl started for the door. "Where are Agnes and Rosamond? Why are they not with you?" "Shermorth may," she said solemnly. Eloise stood up. "Speak up," she said sharply. "They hide something from me. It wasn't the interpreter after all. It was simply the difference of the Norman English. The nobles spoke and the still Saxon sounded. Dialect to the peasants, neither of which sounded anything like the Middle English Mr. Latimer had blithely taught her. It was a wonder the interpreter was picking up anything at all. "I was seeking them when Lady Erminy called good lady," Mazuri said, and the interpreter got it all. Though it was taking several seconds, it gave an imbecilic slowness to Mazuri's speech, which might or might not be appropriate. "Where did you look for them?" "In the stable," Eloise said, and brought her hands together on either side of Maisry's head. Like a pair of cymbals, Maisry howled and clapped a dirty hand to her left ear. Kivrin shrank back against the pillows. "Go and fetch the mustard to Lady Aminy and find you." "Agnes," Maisie nodded, not looking particularly frightened, but still holding her ear. She stumbled another curtsy and went out no more quickly than she'd come in. She seemed less upset by the sudden violence than Kivrin was, and Kivrin wondered if Lady Aminy would get her mustard any time soon. It was the swiftness and the calmness of the violence that had surprised her. Eloise had not even seemed angry, and as soon as Maisry was gone, she went back to the window seat, sat down, and said quietly, "The lady could not be moved. Though her family did come, she can abide with us until my husband returns. He will be here by Christmas surely." There was noise on the stairs. Apparently she'd been wrong, Kivrin thought, and the boxing had done some good. Agnes rushed in, clutching something to her chest. "Agnes," Alois said, "what do you hear?" "I brought the interpreter still didn't have it." "Surret to show the lady, you are a wicked child, to hide from Maisry and come hence to disturb the lady. Emma said she suffers greatly from her injuries, but she told me she wished to see it." She held it up. It was a toy-to-wheeled cart painted red and gilt. "God punishes those who bear false witness." "With everlasting torment," Lady Miney said, grabbing the little girl roughly. "The lady cannot speak, you know full well." "She spoke to me," Agnes said sturdily. "Good for you," Kevin thought. Everlasting torment. What horrible things to threaten a child with. But this was the Middle Ages, when priests taught constantly of the last days and the final judgment of the pains of hell. "She told me she wished to see my wagon." Agnes said she did not have a hound. You are making up tales, Eloise said. The lady cannot speak. And Kevin thought, I have to stop this. They'll box her ears too. She pushed herself up on her elbows. The effort left her breathless. I spoke with Agnes, she said, praying the interpreter would do what it was supposed to. If it chose to blink out again at this moment and ended up getting Agnes a beating, that would be the last straw. I bade her bring her cart to me. Both women turned and looked at her. Eloise's eyes widened. The old woman looked astonished and then angry, as if she thought Kivrin had deceived them. I told you, Agnes said, and marched over to the bed with the wagon. Kevin lay back against the pillows, exhausted. What is this place, she asked. It took Eloise a moment to recover herself. You rest safely in the house of my lord and husband. The interpreter had trouble with the name. It sounded like Guillaume de Ville or possibly de Vaux. Eloise was looking at her anxiously. My husband's privy. Found you in the woods and brought you. Hence, you had been set upon by robbers and grievously injured. Who attacked you? I know not, Kevin said. I am called Eloise, and this is the mother of my husband, the Lady Amini. What is your name? And now was the time to tell them the whole, carefully researched story. She had told the priest her name was Catherine, but Lady Hermione had already made it clear. She put no stock in anything he said. She didn't even believe he could speak Latin. Kivrin could say he had misunderstood. That her name was Isabelle de Beauvier. She could tell them she had called out her mother's. Her sister's name in her delirium. She could tell them. She had been praying to Saint Catherine. Of what family are you? Lady Hermione asked. It was a very good story. It would establish her identity and position in society. And would ensure that they wouldn't try to send. For her family, Yorkshire was too far away, and the road north was impassable. Whither were you bound? Eloise said. Medieval had thoroughly researched the weather and the road conditions. It had rained every day for 2 weeks in December, and there had been a hard frost to freeze the mired roads till late January, but she had seen the road to Oxford. It had been dry and clear and medieval. Had thoroughly researched the color of her dress and the prevalence of glass windows among the upper classes. They had thoroughly researched the language. I remember not, Kevin said. Not, Eloise said, and turned to Lady Hermione. She remembers not. They think I'm saying not. Kevin thought that I don't remember anything. The inflection, the pronunciation. Didn't differentiate between the two words. It is her wound. Eloise said it has shaken her memory. No, nay. Kevin said she was not supposed to feign amnesia. She was supposed to be Isabelle de Beauvoir. From the East Riding, just because the roads were dry here, didn't mean they weren't impassable farther north. And Eloise would not even let Garwin ride to Oxford to get news of her, or to Bath to fetch her husband. She surely wouldn't send him to the East Riding. Can you not even remember your own name? Lady Amani said impatiently. Leaning so close Kevin could smell her breath. It was very foul, an odor of decay. She must have rotting teeth too. What is your name? Mr. Latimer had said. Isabel was the most common woman's name in the 1300s. How common was Catherine and Mary? Evelyn didn't know the daughters' names. What if Yorkshire wasn't distant enough after all, and Lady Herning knew the family? She would take it as further proof that she was a spy. She had better stay with the common name and tell them she was Isabelle de Beauvais. The old woman would be only too happy to believe that the priest had gotten her name wrong. It would be further proof of his ignorance, of his incompetence, further reason to send a Bath for a new chaplain. But he had held Kevin's hand. He had told her not to be afraid. My name is Catherine, she said, transcript from the Doomsday Book. I'm not the only one in trouble. Mr. Dunworthy, I think the contempts who have taken me in are too. The Lord of the Manor, Lord Guillaume, isn't here. He's in Bath testifying at the trial of a friend of his, which is apparently a dangerous thing to do. His mother, Lady Alice, called him a fool for getting mixed up in it. And Lady Alois, his wife, seems worried and nervous. They've come here in a great hurry and without servants. 14th century, noble women had at least one lady in waiting. A piece, but neither Eloise nor Emma has any, and they left the children's. Guillaume's two little girls are here, nurse behind. Lady Amani wanted to send for new one and a chaplain, but Lady Eloise won't let her. I think Lord Guillaume must be expecting trouble, and has spirited his women folk away, here to keep them safe. Or possibly the trouble's already happened. Agnes, the littler of the two girls, told me about the chaplain's death, and someone named Gilbert, whose head was all red. So perhaps there's already been bloodshed. And the women have come here to escape it. One of Lord Guillaume's privates has come with them, and he's fully armed. There weren't any major uprisings against Edward II in Oxfordshire in 1320, although no one was very happy with the king and his favorite, Hugh Despencer, and there were plots and minor skirmishes everywhere else. Two of the barons, Lancaster and Mortimer, took 63 manors away from the Despensers that year. This year, Lord Guillaume or his friend may have got involved in one of those plots. It could be something else entirely, of course a land dispute or something. People in the 1300s spent almost as much time in court as the contempts in the last part of the 20th century. But I don't think so. Lady Alois jumps at every sound, and she has forbidden Lady Eomini to tell the neighbors. They're here, I suppose in one way this is a good thing. If they aren't telling anyone they're here, they won't tell anyone about me. Or send messengers to try to find out who I am. On the other hand, there's the chance of armed men kicking in the door at any moment, or of Garwin, the only person who knows where the drop is, getting killed defending the manor. Break, 5th-10th of December 1320, old style. The interpreter is working now, more or less, and the contempts seem to understand what I'm saying. I can understand them though, they're Middle English. Bears no resemblance to what Mr. Latimer taught me. It's full of inflections and has a much softer French sound. Mr. Latimer wouldn't even recognize his one, that April with his sure shot. The interpreter translates what the contempts say, with the syntax and some of the words intact, and at first I tried to phrase what I said the same way, saying aye and nay, and I remember not of whence I came. But thinking about it's deadly, the interpreter takes forever to come up with a translation. And I stammer and struggle with the pronunciations, so I just speak modern English and hope what comes out of my mouth is close to being right, and that the interpreter isn't slaughtering the idioms and the inflections. Heaven only knows how I sound like a French spy. Probably the language isn't the only thing off. My dress is all wrong, afar to fine a weave, and the blue is too bright, dyed with weight or not. I haven't seen any bright colors at all. I'm too tall. My teeth are too good, and my hands are wrong, in spite of my muddy labors at the dig. They should not only have been dirtier, but I should have chilblains. Everyone's hands, even the children's, are chapped and bleeding. It is, after all, December the 5th-10th. I overheard part of an argument between Lady Hermione and Lady Eloise about getting a replacement chaplain, and Hermione said, "There's more than time enough to send. It is full 10 days till Christ's Mass. So tell Mr. Gilchrist I've ascertained my temporal location, at least, but I don't know how far from the drop I am. I've tried to remember Garwin bringing me here, but that whole night is hopelessly muddled, and part of what I remember didn't happen. I remember a white horse that had bells on its harness, and the bells were playing Christmas carols. Like the Carillon in Carfax Tower, December 5th 10th means it's Christmas Eve there, and you'll be giving your sherry party. And then walking over to St. Mary, the Virgins for the inter-church service. It's hard to comprehend that. You are over 700 years away. I keep thinking that if I got out of bed, which I can't because I'm too dizzy, I think my temp is back up, and open the door, I would find not a medieval hall, but Brazen Nose's lab and all of you waiting for me, Bardry and Dr. Aarons and you. Mr. Dunworthy polishing your spectacles and saying, "I told you so. I wish you were." Chapter 12. Lady Hermione did not believe Kevin's story about having amnesia. When Agnes brought her hound, which turned out to be a tiny black puppy with huge feet, into Kivrin, she said, "This is my hound, Lady Kivrin." She held it out to Kivrin. Clutching its fat middle, "You can pet him. Do you remember how?" "Yes," Kevin said, taking the puppy out of Inez's too tight grasp and stroking its baby soft fur. "Aren't you supposed to be at your sewing?" Agnes took the puppy back from her grandmother, went to chide with the steward, and Mrs. Rayleigh went out to the stable. She twisted the puppy around to give it a kiss. "So I came to speak to you. Grandmother is very angry." The steward and all his family were living in the hall. When we came hence, she gave the puppy another kiss. "Grandmother says it is his wife who tempts him to sin." Grandmother. Agnes had not said anything like grandmother. The word hadn't even existed until the 18th century. But the interpreter was taking huge, disconcerting leaps now, though. It left Inez's mispronunciation of Catherine intact, and sometimes left blanks in places where the meaning should have been obvious from context. She hoped her subconscious knew what it was doing. "Are you adulterous, lady?" Kevin Agnes said. Her subconscious obviously didn't know what it was doing. What she asked, adulteress. Agnes said the puppy was trying desperately to squirm out of Inez's grip. "Grandmother says you are one. She says a wife fleeing to her lover would have good cause to remember naught, an adulteress. Well, at least it was better than a French spy. Or perhaps Lady Arundel thought she was both." Agnes kissed the puppy again. "Grandmother said a lady had no good cause to travel through the woods in winter." Lady Hermione was right, Kevin thought, and so was Mr. Dunworthy. She still had not found out where the drop was, although she had asked to speak with Garwin. When Lady Elwes came in the morning to bathe her temple, "He has ridden out to search for the wicked men who robbed you," Eloise had said, putting an ointment on Kivrin's temple. "That smelled like garlic and stung horribly. Do you remember aught of them?" Kevin had shaken her head, hoping her fake dementia wouldn't end in some poor peasants being hanged. She could scarcely say no. That isn't the man, when she supposedly couldn't remember anything. Perhaps she shouldn't have told them she couldn't remember anything. The probability that they would have known the Dubois was very small, and her lack of an explanation had obviously made Hermione even more suspicious of her. Agnes was trying to put her cap on the puppy. "There are wolves in the woods." She said Garwin slew one with his axe. "Agnes, did Garwin tell you of his finding me?" Kevin asked. "I." "Blackie likes to wear my cap," she said, tying the strings in a choking knot. "He doesn't act like it," Kevin said. "Where did Garwin find me?" "In the woods." Agnes said the puppy twisted out of the cap and nearly fell off the bed. She set it in the middle of the bed and lifted it by its front paws. "Blackie can dance here, let me hold it." Kevin said to rescue the poor thing, she cradled it in her arms. "Where in the woods did Garwin find me?" Agnes stood on tiptoe trying to see the puppy. "Blackie sleeps," she whispered. The puppy was asleep, exhausted from Agnes's attentions. Kevin laid it beside her on the fur bed covering, was the place he found me. Far from here, Agnes said, and Kivrin could tell she had no idea. This was no use. Agnes obviously didn't know anything. She would have to talk to Garwin. Has Garwin returned? Agnes said, stroking the sleeping puppy. Would you speak with him? Yes, Kevin said. Are you adulterous? It was difficult to follow Agnes's conversational jumps. No, she said, and then remembered. She was not supposed to be able to remember anything. I don't remember anything about who I am, Agnes petted Blackie, grandmother says. Only a doctor would ask so boldly to speak with Garwin. The door opened and Rosamond came in. They're looking for you everywhere. Simple head, she said, her hands on her hips. I was speaking with Lady Kevin. Agnes said with an anxious glance at the coverlid, where Blackie lay, nearly invisible against the sable fur. Apparently hounds were not allowed inside. Kevin pulled the rough sheet up over it, so Rosamond wouldn't see, Mother said. The lady must rest so that her wounds will heal. Rosamond said sternly, come, I must tell grandmother I found you. She led the little girl out of the room. Kivrin watched them leave, hoping fervently that Agnes wouldn't tell Lady Hermione. Kivrin had asked again to speak to Garwin. She had thought she had a good excuse to talk to Garwin, that they would understand, that she was anxious to find out about her belongings and her attackers, but it was unseemly for unmarried, noble women in the 1300s to boldly ask to speak to young men. Eloise could talk to him because she was the head of the house, with her husband gone and his employer, and Lady Amani was his lord's mother. But Kevin should have waited until Garwin spoke to her, and then answered him with all modesty. As fits a maid, but I must talk to him, she thought. He's the only one who knows where the drop is. Agnes came dashing back in, and snatched up the sleeping puppy. Grandmother was very angry. She thought I'd fallen in the well, Agnes said, and ran back out again, and no doubt, grandmother had boxed Maisie's ears because of it, Kivrin thought. Masonry had already been in trouble once today, for losing Agnes, who had come to show Kivrin Lady Amine his silver chain, which she said was a reliquary, a word that defeated the interpreter. Inside the little box, she told Kevin, was a piece of the shroud of Saint Stephen. Maisie had had her pocked cheek slapped by Amani for letting Agnes take the reliquary, and for not watching her, though not for letting the little girl in the sick room. None of them seemed concerned at all about the little girls getting close to Kivrin, or to be aware that they might catch what she had, neither Eloise nor Amani took any precautions in caring for her. The Contempts hadn't understood the mechanics of disease transmission. Of course they believed it was a consequence of sin, and epidemics were a punishment from God, but they had known about contagion. The motto of the Black Death had been, depart quickly, go far. Tarry long, and there had been quarantines before that. Not here, Kevin thought. And what if the little girls come down with this? Or Father Roach, he had been near her all through her fever, touching her, asking her name. She frowned, trying to remember that night. She had fallen off the horse, and then there was a fire. No, she had imagined that in her delirium. And the white horse, Garwin's horse, was black. They had ridden through a wood and down a hill, past a church, and the cutthroat had it was no use. The night was a shapeless dream of frightening faces, and bells and flames. Even the drop was hazy, unclear. There had been an oak tree and willows, and she had sat down against the wagon wheel because she felt so dizzy, and the cutthroat had no. She had imagined the cutthroat and the white horse. Perhaps she had imagined the church as well. She would have to ask Garwin where the drop was, but not in front of Lady Hermione. Who thought she was adulterous? She had to get well, to get enough strength to get out of bed, and go down to the hall, out to the stable to find Garwin. To speak to him alone, she had to get better. She was a little stronger, though she was still too weak to walk to the chamber pot. Unaided, the dizziness was gone, and the fever. But her shortness of breath persisted. They apparently thought she was improving too. They had left her alone most of the morning. And Eloise had only stayed long enough to smear on the foul-smelling ointment and have me making proper advances towards Garwin, Quiverin thought. Siren tried not to worry about what Agnes had told her, or why the antivirals hadn't worked, or how far the drop was, and to concentrate on getting her strength back. No one came in all afternoon, and she practiced sitting up and putting her feet over the side of the bed when Maisry came. With a rushlight to help her to the chamber pot, she was able to walk back to the bed by herself. It grew colder in the night, and when Agnes came to see her in the morning, she was wearing a red cloak and hood of very thick wool, and white fur mittens. "Do you wish to see my silver buckle? Sir Blod gave it to me. I will bring it on the morrow. I cannot come today, for we go to cut the Yule log." The Yule log, Kevin said, alarmed. The ceremonial log had traditionally been cut on the 24th, and this was only supposed to be the 17th. Had she misunderstood Lady Amani? Agnes said, "At home we do not go till Christmas Eve, but it is like to storm, and grandmother would have us ride out to fetch it, while it is yet fine weather, like a storm," Kevin thought. How would she recognize the drop if it snowed? The wagon and her boxes were still there, but if it snowed more than a few inches, she would never recognize the road. "Does everyone go to fetch the Yule log?" Kivrin asked. Nay, Father Roach called Mother to tend a sick cotter. That explained why Amani was playing the tyrant, bullying Maisie and the steward, and accusing Kivrin of adultery. "Does your grandmother go with you?" She said. "I will ride my pony." "Does Rosamond go?" "I and the steward." She said impatiently. "All the village goes." "Does Garwin?" "Nay," she said, as if that was self-evident. "I must go out to the stable and bid Blackie farewell." She ran off. Lady Amani was going, and the steward. And Lady Eloise was somewhere nursing a peasant who was ill. And Garwin, for some reason that was obvious to Agnes, but not to her, wasn't. Perhaps he had gone with Eloise, but if he hadn't, if he was staying here to guard the manor, she could talk to him alone. Maisry was obviously going. When she brought Kevin's breakfast, she was wearing a rough brown poncho and had ragged strips of cloth wrapped around her legs. She helped Kivrin to the chamber pot, carried it out, and brought up a brazier full of hot coals, moving with more speed and initiative than Kivrin had seen before. Kevin waited an hour after Maisry left until she was sure they were all gone, and then got out of bed and walked to the window seat and pulled the linen back. She couldn't see anything except branches and dark, gray sky. But the air was even colder than that in the room. She climbed up on the window seat. She was above the courtyard. It was empty, and the large wooden gate stood open. The stones of the courtyard and of the low, thatched roofs around it looked wet. She stuck her hand out, afraid it had already begun to snow, but she couldn't feel any moisture. She climbed down, holding on to the ice-cold stones, and huddled by the brazier. It gave off almost no heat. Kevin hugged her arms to her chest, shivering in her thin shift. She wondered what they had done with her clothes. Clothes were hung on poles beside the bed in the Middle Ages, but this room had no poles and no hooks either. Her clothes were in the chest at the foot of the bed, neatly folded. She took them out, grateful that her boots were still there, and then sat on the closed lid of the chest, for a long time trying to catch her breath. "I have to speak to Garwin this morning," she thought, willing her body to be strong enough. "It's the only time everyone will be gone, and it's going to snow." She dressed, sitting down as much as possible and leaning against the bedpost to pull her hose and boots on, and then went back over to the bed. "I'll rest a little," she thought, "just till I'm warmed through," and was immediately asleep. The bell woke her, the one from the southwest she had heard when she came through. It had rung all yesterday and then stopped, and Eloise had gone over to the window and stood there for a while, as if trying to see what had happened. The light from the window was dimmer, but it was only that the clouds were thicker lower. Kevin put on her cloak and opened the door. The stairs were steep, set into the stone side of the hall, and had no railing. Agnes was lucky she'd only skinned her knee. She might have pitched headlong onto the floor below. Kevin kept her hand on the wall and rested halfway. Looking at the hall, "I'm really here," she thought. It really is 1320. The hearth in the middle of the room glowed a dull red, with the banked coals, and there was a little light from the smoke hole above it and the high narrow windows. But most of the hall was in shadow. She stopped where she was, peering into the smoky gloom, trying to see if anyone was there. The high seat, with its carved back and arms, sat against the end wall, with Lady Eloise's slightly lower, slightly less ornate one next to it. There were tapestries on the wall behind them, and a ladder at the far end of the wall, up to what must be a loft. Heavy wooden tables hung along the outer walls, above the wide benches, and a narrower bench set next to the wall. Just below the stairs, the beggar's bench, and the wall it sat against was the screens. Kirov came down the rest of the stairs and tiptoed across to the screens, her feet crunching loudly on the dried rushes. Scattered on the floor, the screens were really a partition. An inside wall shut off the draft from the door. Sometimes the screens formed a separate room, with box beds in either end, but behind these were only a narrow passage, with the missing hooks for hanging up cloaks. There were no cloaks there now. Good Kevin thought they are all gone. The door was open. On the floor next to it was a pair of shaggy boots, a wooden bucket, and Agnes's cart. Kevin stopped in the little anteroom to catch her already ragged breath, wishing she could sit down a moment, and then looked carefully at the door and went outside. There was no one in the enclosed courtyard. It was cobbled with flattish yellow stones, but the center of it, where a water trough hollowed out of a tree stood, was deep in mud. There were trampled hoof prints and footprints all around it, and several puddles of brown water. A thin, mangy-looking chicken was drinking fearlessly from one of the pools. Chickens had only been raised for their eggs. Pigeons and doves had been the chief meat fowl in the 1300s, and there was the dovecot by the gate, and the thatched-roofed building next to it. Must be the kitchen and the other smaller buildings, the storehouses, the stable. With its wide doors stood along the other side, and then a narrow passage, and then the big stone barn. She tried the stable first. Agnes's puppy came bounding out to meet her, on its clumsy feet yipping happily, and she had to hastily push it back inside and shut the heavy wooden door. Darwin obviously wasn't in there. He wasn't in the barn neither, or in the kitchen, or in the other buildings, the largest of which turned out to be the brewhouse. Agnes had said he wasn't going with the procession, to cut the Yule log, as if it was something obvious, and Kevin had assumed he had to stay here to guard the manor. But now she wondered if he had gone with Eloise to visit the cotter. If he, as she thought, "I'll have to go find the drop myself." She started toward the stable again, but halfway there she stopped. She would never be able to get up on a horse by herself, feeling as weak as she did. And if she did somehow manage it, she was too dizzy to stay on, and too dizzy to go looking for the drop. But I have to, she thought. They're all gone and it's going to snow. She looked toward the gate, and then the passage between the barn and the stable. Wondering which way to go, they had come down a hill. Past a church, she remembered hearing the bell. She didn't remember the gate or the courtyard, but that was most likely the way they had come. She walked across the cobbles, sending the chicken clucking frantically, over to the shelter of the well, and looked out the gate at the road. It crossed a narrow stream with a log bridge, and wound off to the south into the trees. But there wasn't any hill and no church, no village. No indication that that was the way to the drop. There had to be a church. She had heard the bell lying in bed. She walked back into the courtyard and across to the muddy path. An LED passed around, wattle pen with 2 dirty pigs in it, and the privy unmistakable in its smell, and Kevin was afraid that the path was only the way to the outhouse, but it wound around behind the privy, and opened out onto a green, and there was the village, and the church sitting at the far end of the green, just the way Kevin remembered it, and beyond it was the hill they had come down. The green didn't look like a green, it was a ragged open space, with huts on one side and a willow-edged stream on the other. But there was a cow grazing on what was left of the grass, and a goat tethered to a big, leafless oak. The huts struggled along the near side, between piles of hay and muck heaps, getting smaller and more shapeless, the farther they were from the manor house. But even the one closest to the manor house, which should be the steward's, was nothing but a hovel. It was all smaller and dirtier, and more tumbled down than the illustrations in the history vids. Only the church looked the way it was supposed to. The bell tower stood separate from it, between the churchyard and the green. It had obviously been built later than the church. With its Norman round arch windows and gray stone, the tower was tall and round, and its stone was yellower, almost golden. A track no wider than the road near the drop, LED past the churchyard and the tower, and up the hill into the woods. That's the way we came, Kevin thought, and started across the green. But as soon as she stepped out of the shelter of the barn, the wind hit her. It went through her cloak as if it were nothing, and seemed to stab into her chest. She pulled the cloak tight around her neck, held it with her flattened hand against her chest, and went on. The bell in the southwest began again. She wondered what it meant. Eloise and Amaryllis had talked about it, but that was before she could understand what they were saying, and when it began again yesterday, Eloise hadn't even acted like she heard it. Perhaps it was something to do with Advent. The bells were supposed to ring at twilight, on Christmas Eve, and then for an hour before midnight. Kevin knew. Perhaps they rang at other times during Advent as well. The track was muddy and rutted. Kevin's chest was beginning to hurt. She pressed her hand tighter against it and went on, trying to hurry. She could see movement out beyond the fields. They would be the peasants coming back with the Yule log, or getting in the animals. She couldn't make them out. It looked as if it were already snowing out there. She must hurry. The wind whipped her cloak around her and swirled dead leaves past her. The cow moved off the green, its head down into the shelter of the huts, which were no shelter at all. They seemed hardly taller than Kevin, and as if they had been bundled together out of sticks and propped in place, and they didn't stop the wind at all. The bell continued to ring, a slow, steady tolling. and Kevin realized she had slowed her tread to match it. She mustn't do that, she must hurry. It might start snowing any minute. But hurrying made the pain stab so sharply. She began to cough. She stopped. Bent double with the coughing. She was not going to make it. Don't be foolish, she told herself. You have to find the drop. Ural, you have to get back home. Go as far as the church. And you can rest inside for a minute. She started on again, willing herself not to cough. But it was no use, she couldn't breathe. She couldn't make it to the church, let alone the drop. You have to make it. She shouted to herself over the pain. You have to will yourself to make it. She stopped again, bending over against the pain. She had been worried that a peasant would come out of one of the huts. But now she wished someone would, so they could help her back to the manor. They wouldn't. They were all out in this freezing wind. Bringing in the Yule log and gathering up the animals, she looked out toward the fields. The distant figures who had been out there were gone. She was opposite the last hut. Beyond it was a scattering of ramshackle sheds. She hoped no one lived in. And surely nobody did. They must be outbuildings. Cow byres and granaries, and beyond them surely not that far away the church. Perhaps if I take it slowly, she thought, and started toward the church again. Her whole chest jarred at every step. She stopped, swaying a little. Thinking, I mustn't faint. No one knows where I am. She turned and looked back at the manor house. She couldn't even get back to the hall. I have to sit down, she thought. But there was nowhere to sit in the muddy track. Lady Eloise was tending the cotter. Lady Amory and the girls in the entire village were out, cutting the Yule log. No one knows where I am. The wind was picking up, coming now, not in gusts, but in a straight, determined push across the fields. I must try to get back to the house, Kevin thought, but she couldn't do that either. Even standing was too much of an effort. If there were anywhere to sit, she would sit down, but the space between the huts, right up to their fences, was all mud. She would have to go into the hut. It had a rickety wattle fence around it, made by weaving green branches between stakes. The fence was scarcely knee-high and wouldn't have kept a cat out, let alone the sheep and cows it was intended against. Only the gate had supports even waist-high, and Kivrin leaned gratefully against one of them. Hello, she shouted into the wind. Is anyone there? The front door of the hut was only a few steps from the gate, and the hut couldn't be soundproof. It wasn't even windproof. She could see a hole in the wall, where the daubed clay and chopped straw had cracked and fallen away from the matted branches underneath. They could surely hear her. She lifted the loop of leather that held the gate shut, went in and knocked on the low plank door. There was no answer, and Kevin hadn't expected any. She shouted again, is anyone home? Not even bothering to listen to how the interpreter translated it, and tried to lift the wooden bar that lay across it. It was too heavy. She tried to slide it out of the notches, cut in the protruding lintels, but she couldn't. The hat looked like it could blow away at any minute, and she couldn't get the door open. She would have to tell Mr. Dunworthy. Medieval hats weren't as flimsy as they looked. She leaned against the door, holding her chest. Something made a sound behind her, and she turned already, saying, I'm sorry I intruded into your garden. It was the cow, leaning casually over the fence and browsing among the brown leaves, hardly reaching at all. She would have to go back to the manor. She used the gate for support, making sure she shut it behind her, and looped the leather back over the stake, and then the cow's bony back. The cow followed with her a few steps, as if it thought Kivrin was leading it in to be milked, and then went back to the garden, the door of one of the sheds. that nobody could possibly live in opened, and a barefoot boy came out. He stopped looking frightened. Kevin tried to straighten up. "Please," she said, breathing hard between the words. "May I rest a while in your house?" The boy stared dumbly at her. His mouth hanging open, he was hideously thin. His arms and legs, no thicker than the twigs in the hut fences. "Please run and tell someone to come tell them I'm ill." "He can no more run than I can," she thought as soon as she said it. The boy's feet were blue with cold. His mouth looked sore, and his cheeks and upper lip were smeared with dried blood from a nosebleed. "He's got scurvy," Kevin thought. "He's worse off than I am," but she said again, "Run to the manor and bid them come." The boy crossed himself with a chapped, bony hand. "Big hole in my throat. Looked a hound and blue sturdy," he said, backing into the hut. "Oh no." Kevin thought despairingly, "He can't understand me, and I don't have the strength to try to make him. Please help me," she said, and the boy looked almost like he understood that. He took a step toward her, and then darted suddenly away. In the direction of the church. "Wait," Kevin called. He darted past the cow and around the fence, and disappeared behind the hut. Kevin looked at the shed. It could scarcely even be called that. It looked more like a haystack, grass and pieces of thatch wadded into the spaces between the poles, but its door was a mat of sticks, tied together with blackish rope, the kind of door you could blow down with one good breath, and the boy had left it open. She stepped over the raised doorstep and went into the hut. It was dark inside and so smoky. Kivrin couldn't see anything. It smelled terrible, like a stable, worse than a stable. Mingled with the barnyard smells was smoke and mildew, and the nasty odor of rats. Kevin had had to bend over, almost double, to get through the door. She straightened and hit her head on the sticks that served as crossbeams. There was nowhere to sit in the hut, if that was really what it was. The floor was as covered with sacks and tools as if it was a shed after all, and there was no furniture except an uneven table, whose rough legs splayed unevenly from the center. But the table had a wooden bowl and a heel of bread on it, and in the center of the hut, in the only cleared space, a little fire was burning in a shallow dugout hole. It was apparently the source of all the smoke, even though there was a hole in the ceiling above it. For a draft, it was a little fire, only a few sticks, but the other holes in the unevenly stuffed walls and roof drew the smoke too, and the wind coming in from everywhere gusted it around the cramped hut. Kevin started to cough, which was a terrible mistake. Her chest felt as if it would break apart. With every spasm, gritting her teeth to keep from coughing, she eased herself down on a sack of onions, holding onto the spade propped against it, and then the fragile-looking wall. She felt immediately better as soon as she was sitting down. Even though it was so cold, she could see her breath. "I wonder how this place smells in the summer," she thought. She wrapped her cloak around her, folding the tails like a blanket across her knees. There was a cold draft along the floor. She tucked the cloak around her feet, and then picked up a billhook lying next to the sack and poked at the meager fire with it. The fire blazed up half-heartedly, illuminating the hut, and making it look more than ever like a shed. A low lean-to had been built on at one side, probably for a stable because it was partitioned off from the rest of the hut by an even lower fence than the cottage had had. The fire wasn't bright enough for Kevin to see into the lean-to corner, but a scuffling sound came from it. A pig maybe, although the pigs were supposed to have been slaughtered by now. Or maybe a milk goat. She poked at the fire again, trying to get a little more light on the corner. The scuffling sound came from in front of the pathetic fence, from a large dome-shaped cage. It was elaborately out of place in the filthy corner. With its smooth curved metal band, its complicated door, its fancy handle. Inside the cage, its eyes glinting in the firelight. Kivrin had stirred up was a rat. It sat on its haunches, its hand-like paws, holding the chunk of cheese that had tempted it into imprisonment. Watching Kevin, there were several other crumbled and probably moldy bits of cheese on the floor of the cage. More food than in this entire hut. Kevin thought, sitting very still on the lumpy sack of onions. One wouldn't think they had anything worth protecting from a rat. She had seen a rat before, of course, in History of Psych, and when they tested her for phobias during her first year. But not this kind. Nobody had seen this kind in England, at least in 50 years. It was a very pretty rat actually, with silky black fur. Not much bigger than History of Psych's white laboratory rats. Not nearly as big as the brown rat she'd been tested with. It looked much cleaner than the brown rat too. It had looked like it belonged in the sewers and drains and tube funnels it had no doubt come out of. With its matted dust brown coat and long, obscenely naked tail. When she had first started studying the Middle Ages, she had been unable to understand how the contempts had tolerated the disgusting things in their barns, let alone their houses. The thought of the one in the wall by her bed that had filled her with revulsion. But this rat was actually quite clean looking, with its black eyes and shiny coat. Certainly cleaner than Mousy, and probably more intelligent. Harmless looking, as if to prove her point. The rat took another dainty nibble on the cheese. "You're not harmless though," Kevin said. "You're the scourge of the Middle Ages." The rat dropped the chunk of cheese. And took a step forward, its whiskers twitching. It took hold of two of the metal bars with its pinkish hands and looked appealingly through them. "I can't let you out, you know," Kevin said, and its ears pricked up as if it understood her. "You eat precious grain and contaminate food and carry fleas, and in another 28 years, you and your chums will wipe out half of Europe. You're what Lady Hermione should be worrying about, instead of French spies and illiterate priests." The rat looked at her. "I'd like to let you out, but I can't. The Black Death was bad enough as it was. It killed half of Europe. If I let you out, your descendants might make it even worse." The rat let go of the bars and began running around the cage, crashing against the bars, circling in frantic random movements. "I'd let you out if I could," Kivrin said. The fire had nearly gone out. Kivrin stirred it again, but it was all ashes, the door she had left open. In the hope that the boy would bring someone back, looking for her banged shut, plunging the hut in darkness. "They won't have any idea where to look for me," Kevin thought, and knew they weren't even looking yet. They all thought she was in the upstairs room asleep. Lady Hermione wouldn't even check on her until she brought her supper. They wouldn't even start to look for her until after Vespers, and by then it would be dark. It was very quiet in the hut. The wind must have died down. She couldn't hear the rat. A twig on the fire snapped once, and sparks flew onto the dirt floor. "Nobody knows where I am," she thought, and put her hand up to her chest, as if she'd been stabbed. "Nobody knows where I am. Not even Mr. Dunworthy," but surely that wasn't true. Lady Eloise might have come back and gone up to put more ointment on. Or Mary might have been sent home by Amine, or the boy might have darted off to fetch the men from the fields, and they would be here any minute, even though the door was shut, and even if they didn't realize she was gone. Until after Vespers, they had torches and lanterns, and the parents of the boy with scurvy would come back to cook supper and find her, and would go and fetch someone from the manor. No matter what happens, she told herself, "You're not completely alone," and that comforted her. because she was completely alone. She had tried to convince herself she wasn't, that some reading on the net screen had told Gilchrist and Montoir something had gone wrong, that Mr. Dunworthy had made bedrid. Check and recheck everything, that they knew what had happened somehow, and were holding the drop open, but they weren't. They no more knew where she was than Agnes and Lady Eloise did. They thought she was safely in Skendgate, studying the Middle Ages with the drop clearly located. And the quarter, already half full of observations about quaint customs and rotation of crops, they wouldn't even realize she was gone until they opened the drop into weeks, and by then, it will be dark, Kevin said. She sat still watching the fire. It was nearly out, and there weren't any more sticks anywhere that she could use. She wondered if the boy had been left at home to gather faggots and what they would do for a fire tonight. She was all alone and the fire was going out, and nobody knew where she was, except the rat that was going to kill half of Europe. She stood up, cracking her head again, pushed the door of the hut open and went outside. There was still no one in sight in the field. The wind had died down, and she could hear the bell from the southwest tolling clearly. A few flakes of snow drifted out of the gray sky. The little rise the church was on was completely obscured with snow. Kevin started toward the church. Another bell began. It was more to the south and closer, but with a higher, more metallic sound. That meant it was a smaller bell. It tolled steadily too, but a little behind the first bell, so that it sounded like an echo. "Kevin, Lady Kevin," Agnes called. "Where have you been?" She ran up beside Kevin, her round little face red with exertion or cold or excitement. "We've been looking everywhere for you." She darted back in the direction she'd come from, shouting, "I found her! I found her!" "Nay, you did not." Rosamond said, "We all saw her." She hurried forward ahead of Lady Amory and Macery, who had her ragged poncho thrown over her shoulders. Her ears were bright red. She looked sullen, which probably meant she had been blamed for Kevin's disappearance, or thought she was going to be. Or maybe she was just cold. Lady Hermione looked furious. "You didn't know it was Kevin?" Agnes shouted, running back to Kevin's side. "You said you were not certain it was Kevin. I was the one who found her." Rosamond ignored her. She took hold of Kevin's arm. "What has happened? Why did you leave your bed?" she asked anxiously. "Garwin came to speak with you, and found that you had gone." "Gawain came," Kevin thought weakly. "Gawain? Who could have told me exactly where the drop is? And I wasn't there. He came to tell you." "That he had found no trace of your attackers, and that Lady Hermione came up. Whither were you bound?" she said, and it sounded like an accusation. "I could not find my way back," Kevin said, trying to think what to say. To explain her wandering about the village. "Went you to meet someone?" Lady Amani demanded, and it was definitely an accusation. "How could she go to meet someone?" Rosamond asked. "She knows no one here and remembers Nauta." "Before I went to look for the place where I was found," Kevin said, trying not to lean on Rosamond, "I thought maybe the sight of my belongings might help you to remember," Rosamond said, "but you need not have risked your health to do so." Lady Amani said, "Garwin has fetched them here this day." "Everything?" Kevin asked. Rosamond said, "The wagon and all your boxes." The second bell stopped, and the first bell kept on alone steadily. Slowly and surely, it was a funeral. It sounded like the death of hope itself. Garwin had brought everything to the manor. "It is not meet to hold Lady Catherine talking in this cold," Rosamond said, sounding like her mother. "She has been ill. We must need to get her inside ere she catches a chill." "I have already caught a chill," Kevin thought. Garwin had brought everything to the manor, all traces of where the drop had been. Even the wagon. You are to blame for this misery, Lady Amani said, pushing Maisie forward to take Kevin's arm. You should not have left her alone. Kevin flinched away from the filthy massery. Can you walk? Rosamond asked, already buckling under Kevin's weight. Should we bring the mare? No, Kevin said. She somehow couldn't bear the thought of that, brought back like a captured prisoner. On the back of a jangling horse. No, she repeated. I can walk.